I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 276: The Politician's Battlefield. In a conference room on the third floor of the Admiralty building in London, England, the First Lord of the Army, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and a group of naval officers, including General Winter and other young officers, engaged in a heated discussion about the Battle of the Dardanelles. "We should halt this operation," General Winter declared at the meeting. "This plan may have had a chance of success at the beginning, but it has now failed, and we must accept the result. Trying to commit more troops and resources to a battle that has almost no hope is more like a gamble than a war." The young officers supported Charles's view. They consistently believed that the idea of winning a war and forcing a country to surrender solely through naval power was unrealistic, and that those days were over. Even if the powerful Allied fleet could penetrate the Strait of Marmara, even if the fleet could set up cannons beneath Constantinople, would the Ottoman Empire surrender? The younger officers argued, they only need to withdraw their troops a dozen kilometers away, and then you can do whatever you want. Why surrender? The First Minister of the Navy retorted with a grim face. Why isn't war a gamble? Should we condemn it to death just because of a small setback? No, we shouldn't give up, Your Excellency. General Winter stared at the First Minister of the Navy in disbelief. We lost 3 battleships in one day, and 3 more are severely damaged and incapacitated, and you consider this just a small setback. This was already a third of their strength. They could even form the navy of a nation. The First Admiral smiled slightly, rose calmly, and replied, "Gentlemen, first we should look at the personnel losses in this battle." He picked up the documents in his hand, waved them at everyone, then turned around and said, "You may have already received the battle report. Only 728 casualties in the entire battle." The First Admiral tossed the documents onto the table and pointed heavily with his finger. 728? This number of casualties is negligible. The Army can suffer thousands, even tens of thousands of casualties in a single day. Are we, the Navy, going to be intimidated by such a small number? The First Admiral didn't provide a detailed analysis, and those present tacitly avoided discussing it, but they all understood. The majority of the 728 casualties were from the HMS Bouvet. It sank in just over 2 minutes after a single explosion, and the vast majority of its crew failed to escape in time. Over 600 people were taken to the bottom of the sea with the warship. But the Bouvet was a French warship, the casualties were French, and the British crew actually suffered only a little over 100 casualties. This was indeed negligible. The First Lord of the Admiral's words were immediately met with opposition from Admiral Winter. "We are not the Army, Your Excellency. We have lost 6 capital ships." 3. Admiral Winter, the First Lord of the Admiral, corrected him. "The other ships are merely damaged." He then added passionately, "The damaged ships can be largely repaired in the Maltese shipyard in a month or 6 weeks and then returned to the battlefield. As for the sunken battleships, they are destined to become scrap metal under any circumstances, and even if they haven't sunk, they will soon be decommissioned and sent to the shipyard for scrap." This statement was met with fierce opposition from the naval officers, who responded angrily, "Mines cannot distinguish between old and new warships, Your Excellency. The reason the old warships were lost is because they were always at the forefront, with the new warships following behind. If the old warships are all destroyed, should it be the new warships' turn next? If you think so, why don't you board the HMS Queen Elizabeth and fight this battle yourself?" The First Lord of the Admiralty's statement is utterly illogical. While the sunken warships were indeed old for Britain, they were still quite advanced by global standards at that time. Moreover, in dealing with mines, the difference between old and new warships is indeed irrelevant. General Winter considered these words an insult to the dignity of the Navy. He abruptly stood up and glared at the First Lord of the Navy. "Your Excellency, I believe you must understand one thing. These old warships are sacred." When many crew members were young officers, their first instruction upon stepping onto the deck was, "It is a disgrace to abandon a warship." They will remain with it even as they become veterans, even captains. They retain this understanding deeply, and you, however, treat them with disdain, even regarding them as expendable, as junk to be scrapped even if they aren't sunk. The First Lord of the Navy interrupted General Winter. I understand, General, but for a leader, warships have no emotional value in war. Warships are merely tools, machines used for risking in war, which, if necessary, can be sacrificed for a common cause and the fundamental policies of the nation. I believe this is well worth it. General Winter and the other naval officers were at a loss for words. What the First Lord of the Navy said seemed to be the truth. It was they, the naval officers, who had emotionalized and anthropomorphized a war machine. This is the result of politicians directing military operations. They don't consider the troops' feelings, morale, or the realities of the battlefield. They only consider their own political interests and reputation. The key point is that politicians usually have better oratory skills. They can dominate the battlefield of the conference room, leaving the military speechless, even when facts have proven the politicians wrong. Ultimately, the Royal Navy agreed to continue fighting after lobbying from the First Lord of the Admiralty, but refused to accept the absurd claim that the Navy can win. This suited the First Lord of the Admiralty perfectly. He had already persuaded the Secretary of War to involve him in the plan. Their idea was, the Navy almost achieved victory. Now, with the Army's cooperation, we can end the war gloriously without much effort. They would then be the architects of a great victory, having single-handedly created a turning point in World War I and ended the war, bringing them unimaginable political benefits. General Winter, however, sent a pessimistic telegram to Charles. I feel we are sinking deeper and deeper into the quagmire, heading from one disaster to an even worse one, but I am powerless to stop it. I can only place my hopes on you. If anyone can save them, I believe it will be you. Please be prepared. These words reminded Charles. Before this, Charles had also hoped to stop the battle, or at least steer it in a positive direction through intelligence. But it seemed to have had little effect. If it couldn't be stopped, perhaps some preparations could be made in advance? Chapter 277 The Progenitor of Landing Ships. Note, the image below shows the Pont Alma in Paris. The soldier of Juarez statue on the bridge pier has long been a de facto tool for Parisians to gauge water levels. People know what water levels at ankle, waist, or chest levels represent or what measures to take. In 1910, the floodwaters reached the statue's neck, and the water receded for 2 whole months. Not until mid-March, as mid-February arrives, temperatures rise and the snow melts. This year, the heavy snow arrived early and left late, and this unusual weather brought considerable flooding to Paris. The Seine, Paris's first river, swelled, and parts of its banks were submerged. On the pier of the Pont Alma, not far from the Eiffel Tower, the famous soldier of Juarez statue was already 1/3 submerged. In the past, this might have drawn the attention of Parisians, even prompting preparations for potential flooding, but this year people seemed indifferent. Compared to war, the rising river seemed insignificant. In the Schneider Arms factory office, James gazed at the incessantly falling drizzle outside the window, lost in thought. The Allied landings in the Dardanelles have begun. James discovers something interesting. Charles's inventions seem impractical at sea. Although he's recently been in close contact with Wells, that's only because Charles saved his only son, Tigeny. Does this mean Charles is only capable of inventing land-based equipment? This is good news. Schneider should seize upon this weakness in Charles to gain an advantage in naval warfare, thereby competing with Charles for the arms market. No, not the market, but the power of discourse. James understands this isn't about money, but about power, being the true decision-maker in this country. If one day, all the artillery, firearms, and ships used by the French army are produced by Schneider, or are related to Schneider, then even the members of parliament will have to defer to James. This is another level of rule. France is indeed a free country, but if those who make decisions, including members of parliament, are not involved with Schneider, then James is the de facto ruler. However, this plan faces a major challenge: Charles, and his inventions. James appeared calm on the surface, but inwardly he was screaming, "Creativity, creativity, I need creativity." Only creativity can defeat Charles, otherwise, it's all just empty talk. Paulina's cheerful, hurried footsteps sounded behind him. James turned around. He knew this meant good news. Sure enough, Paulina entered with a delighted expression. Before she even reached James, she pulled a document from her handbag and waved it, saying with a hint of pride, "Sir, you should take a look at this." James took the document, flipped through it, and looked up in confusion. A ship, Yes, Paulina nodded. James looked at it more closely and said, I guess it's a coal carrier. Having worked in the steel industry for many years, he naturally knew the characteristics of coal carriers. They usually had wide hulls, which allowed them to carry more weight while having a shallow draft. Yes, Paulina nodded again. James was disappointed. He handed the documents back to Pauline. You want me to buy this ship? Then buy it. Yes, Pauline replied, but didn't take the documents. Take another look, sir. James was getting impatient, but he still glanced at the coal ship again and noticed something unusual. There are 2 doors on the side of the bow. And a gangway has been added. Are you trying to tell me that this way we can haul coal ashore from the side? No, sir, Pauline replied, it's for hauling people ashore. To be precise, fully armed soldiers. Soldiers, James's eyes lit up. Was this a military innovation? Sure enough, Paulina explained, the Allied forces are conducting a landing operation in the Dardanelles, but progress is slow. One reason is that after the transport ships arrive at their destination, the soldiers have to climb down rope ladders and then take small boats to the other side. James suddenly understood. During this time, the soldiers face enemy artillery bombardment and dense bullets. They've already suffered more than half their casualties before even landing. Yes, Paulina replied, but this kind of ship can solve this problem perfectly. It can carry 2,000 soldiers ashore and run aground on the shallows. The soldiers can disembark from the bowside door along the ship's side and then use a makeshift pontoon bridge or go directly ashore to launch a surprise attack. The whole process only takes a few minutes. Fantastic, Paulina, fantastic, James exclaimed. This was exactly what he needed. He had finally beaten Charles to it. Then James hesitated. Who invented this? He worried that it was related to Charles again. It was a naval lieutenant commander named Onwin, Pauline replied. He provided the idea, and I contacted him immediately and bought the industrial rights for 20,000 francs. James almost burst out laughing. Such an idea for only 20,000 francs. These fools. Did they know the Navy might need hundreds of these ships for amphibious landings, which could even help the Allies win this war? Thinking this, James didn't hesitate for a moment and ordered Pauline, immediately modify these ships, along with the corresponding landing facilities. I'll contact the military. Yes, sir, Pauline readily replied. During this time, she had sent many spies into the military to monitor potential ideas, and finally she had found a practical one. Now, they should be able to turn the tide. In the noisy House of Representatives, Gallieni was being questioned about his refusal to send Charles to the Dardanelles. This was Gallieni's 3rd time being questioned in the House of Representatives, and they were asking the same question. General, we want to know your reasons for refusing. Isn't the reason obvious? Gallieni replied, Charles is a brilliant researcher, the equipment he invented changed the entire war, and yet you intend to send him to the battlefield to risk his life. But General, the battlefield needs him. Grevy stood up and answered, this could be a decisive battle. Once we win, we could very well end this war. Yes, Armand stood up and echoed, we only asked him to stay on the warship to boost the morale of the troops, because the soldiers trust him. He can stay away from the battlefield. Is that considered risky? Immediately, someone else chimed in, if that's considered risky, then what about the general inspecting the front lines? He's just a colonel, and he's an adult. No one is special. Everyone should do their part in the war. Gallieni, his face dark, cursed it inwardly, aren't you guys special? You're the ones who most need to be on the battlefield. The image above shows the transport ship USS Clyde River, which was converted from a coal carrier. 2 doors were added to the side of the bow to add gangways. It was used in the Dardanelles landings and is considered the ancestor of landing ships. Chapter 278 Seals Toys. While Gallieni was struggling to deal with the parliamentarians' pressure to resign, Charles was meeting with Wells in the conference room of the Ritz Hotel. This was Charles's first meeting with Wells. Wells seemed preoccupied, his expressionless face scrutinizing Charles sitting opposite him. The young man before him looked no different from an ordinary person, even bearing a touch of childishness. If Wells hadn't known that this young man was Charles, the man who had driven all of France mad, he would have certainly mistaken him for an ordinary person. It's an honor to meet you, Colonel. Wells politely leaned forward to shake hands with Charles, then glanced at Tigeny sitting beside him. Please allow me to express my gratitude to you. You saved Tigeny. No, sir, Charles interrupted Wells. As a soldier, it's what I should do. Charles truly believed this. Soldiers fought for their country, and mutual rescues had nothing to do with personal grudges. If there was any connection, it should be attributed to France. Wells nodded slightly, praising, "Your ideas about torpedoes are very constructive. We're currently looking for explosives with greater power than TNT, so that, as you said, we can reduce the size of the warhead." Wells seemed to be rambling on, repeating what Charles had already relayed to him through Tychony. But Charles understood that Wells was testing him. Wells clearly didn't quite believe in Charles's abilities, and bringing up the old topic was just a way to test Charles's true skills on the spot. "Hexanitrotaphenylamine," Charles blurted out a word out of the blue. "What?" Wells was taken aback. Tychony was also confused. What was hexanitrotaphenylamine? Charles calmly explained, "A more powerful explosive, 60% TNT plus 40% hexanitrotaphenylamine, will be 7% more powerful than pure TNT." Wells' eyes widened instantly. He looked at Charles with disbelief, his voice trembling. This is true? A 7% increase, although 7% isn't much, it's still a breakthrough, and it's foreseeable that this will be the first step in increasing torpedo range." Tychony asked, "Colonel, how do you know this? And even the detailed proportions? Do you have research in this area?" "You guessed right, General," Charles answered decisively. "I've assembled a research and development team for this, and we've made great progress." This wasn't true. He didn't have any research team at all. Charles said this for two reasons. First, it explained how he knew the formula. Second, it was to tell Wells, "I control torpedo development. Choose me or Schneider, the choice is yours." This would make Wells, who was still wavering in the middle, make a decision. Wells had been in the business world for many years. He knew Charles's intentions perfectly well. He considered for a moment, then a kind smile gradually appeared on his face. "Excellent. With a research and development team assembled by the Colonel, I feel very reassured." Charles smiled. He knew this was Wells expressing his stance. Tychony, however, looked confused. He faintly understood, yet it was as if he didn't. Charles then cut to the chase, taking two sketches from his briefcase and handing them to Wells. "Sir, I would like you to build these two types of boats for me." Wells took the documents, glanced at them, and frowned, his face full of doubt. Both were boats he had never seen before, their appearance quite strange. One had a large space in the middle, with a high, upturned bow, like a clown's boot. The other, though called a boat, looked like a car. What was the point of building such little contraptions? Did Charles suddenly decide he wanted a few boats to cruise on the Seine? And with the Seine flooding, piloting such boats on the Seine would surely attract a lot of attention. Tychony leaned closer to examine it for a while, then suddenly became excited. "Colonel, you wouldn't be thinking of using this kind of ship for a landing operation in the Dardanelles, would you?" Tychony's reminder made Wells realize that this was a military vessel designed for amphibious operations. Charles nodded slightly. Since Wells was to be commissioned to build the ship, its purpose and requirements had to be specified so that he would know which direction to take. "Yes," Charles explained, "as far as I know, our troops are still using wooden boats for landings. They are not only slow but also very dangerous, and they are easily destroyed by the enemy at sea." Tychony, both surprised and delighted, took the two sketches and looked at them again and again, excitedly interjecting, "With these two types of boats, the landing will be much faster. How did you come up with this? My God, they are so beautiful." As he spoke, Tychony picked up the first sketch. "This can carry a large number of soldiers ashore quickly. The iron plate in front can provide cover for the soldiers. Once they reach the shallows, they can be lowered and used as stepping stones for the soldiers to land." The image above shows the USL CVP landing craft. He then picked up the second sketch. "If I'm not mistaken, this kind of boat can travel on both the sea and the shore at the same time, and supplies can be transported directly from the boat to the landed troops." The image above shows the Duck amphibious landing craft. Charles nodded, realizing that Tychony had quite an eye for equipment. He could tell the purpose at a glance. Wells glanced at Tychony, then at Charles, and finally his gaze settled again on the two sketches he had initially considered Charles' toys. Looking at the drawings and considering Tychony's words carefully, he suddenly understood. Wells felt a surge of emotion. He had a new understanding of Charles and was now certain of his abilities. On the other hand, Wells was also quite pleased. Tychony didn't seem as useless as he had thought, and it seemed he had learned something from joining the army. Seeing Wells staring blankly at the sketches, Charles asked, "Is there any difficulty in producing these two types of ships?" No. Wells looked carefully and answered confidently, "No difficulty at all. In fact, they're very simple." Indeed, they were simple. The first landing craft was practically just an engine with a hull. The second amphibious landing craft might be more complex, but it only required solving the switch between propeller and wheel drive. Everything else was existing technology. "How many do you need?" Wells asked. 20 of each, Charles replied. "Delivery in 2 weeks, no problem," Wells readily agreed. This was a piece of cake for his shipyard. Charles added, "For the sake of surprise on the battlefield, it's top secret, sir." "Understood," Wells replied confidently. "Understood. The workers involved will be kept under house arrest in the shipyard until they appear on the battlefield." Chapter 279 The Pressure of Public Opinion. Back at headquarters, Charles was surprised to find Gallieni not at his desk. "Is the general still in the house?" Charles asked Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. "No, he's back." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand gestured towards the lounge, his expression a mixture of anger and worry. "They tortured the general for over 2 hours. It seems his old injury has flared up again." Charles grunted in response without saying anything, made himself a cup of coffee, and gently knocked on the lounge door. "Come in," came Gallieni's weak voice from inside. Charles cautiously opened the door and entered, placing the coffee on the table. He asked softly, "General, should I call a medic for you?" Gallieni frowned, his face pale. He slowly sat up in bed, shaking his head. "The cause is shrapnel lodged in the wound. The medic can't do anything. You don't need to argue with him," Charles said, shifting the topic to the council. "It's like your wound, the cause is internal. No matter how you try to stop it, it's futile." Gallieni's hand, holding the coffee, paused in midair before he put it back. "You mean, they will eventually send you to the battlefield?" "Yes," Charles replied. "It's not a matter of should or shouldn't, but rather that my power is not yet sufficient." Gallieni pondered for a moment, then nodded slightly. He understood what was going on. The right wing feared that Charles would lead France into a new industrial boom, thus completely marginalizing the right wing in France. While the left wing appeared to be capitalists like Charles, many had become his competitors due to his rapid rise, and they too hoped to stop him. The most ideal and straightforward solution would be to send Charles to the battlefield, to a dangerous place. Gallieni couldn't help but scoff. "That's exactly what they wanted when they sent you into the army, and they still claim it's just to boost morale." Charles remained silent. The reality was far more complex than Gallieni imagined. Previously, even Parliament couldn't send Charles to the battlefield because the French people wouldn't allow it. If Parliament did, the French people would erupt in protests or strikes. Now, even the French people wanted Charles to save the Dardanelles from this mess. "Only Charles can win this battle. We should let Charles command it. This is a crucial battle. If we win, we can end this war. Countless soldiers are sacrificing on the front lines. Only Charles can save them." The people's thoughts were varied. Some were driven by French pride. They believed that if Britain failed while France succeeded, they would be proud and honored. Some were simply concerned because their loved ones were fighting in the Dardanelles, and they didn't want them to be in danger, hoping Charles could bring them back before they were killed. Others believed that winning the Dardanelles campaign would end the war and hoped Charles could save France one last time. From this perspective, Parliament hadn't gone against the people's will. On the contrary, they were precisely voicing the voice of the French people. Of course, this shift in public opinion was inseparable from the covert manipulation by the right wing and capitalists. For example, some newspapers, including Le Petit Journal, had subtly reported on related topics. Charles didn't mention these things because Gallieni knew it would be futile. He was a pure soldier, concerned only with the war and not with politics or public opinion. "I'm an adult," Charles said calmly. "If they find they can convince you, they'll soon question me." Gallieni was taken aback. This was indeed a possibility. Parliament had the right to question any government or military official, as long as it didn't involve military secrets. Charles continued, "Then they'll ask me a question I can't answer. Colonel, as a soldier, are you willing to fight for France in the Dardanelles?" Charles pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Gallieni, a confident smile on his face. What should I say then, no, or yes? The former would make Charles a disgrace to the military, turning him overnight from a French hero into a coward, a deserter. Then Charles would lose the people's hearts, everything he had built would be overturned, and he would have no more resources or opportunities to contend with his opponents, just like Boulanger was overthrown. The latter, well, there's nothing to say. If Charles himself is willing to go to the battlefield, what right does Gallieni have to stop him? What is his intention? Thinking of this, Gallieni nodded slightly. Then you must make it clear to them that you are on a warship, not on a landing operation." Charles didn't speak, just stared quietly at Gallery. Gallery understood Charles's expression and asked in surprise, "You intend to launch a landing operation? You think they'll let me go?" Charles countered. "If I'm not going to land on a warship, then what's the point of sending me?" He paused, then added, "They can use the same methods to force me onto the battlefield. For example, they can send several media outlets to follow me on the warship. Reporters will be chasing me every day asking, 'What do you think of the casualties on the battlefield? Do you think you should personally lead the troops, or do you plan to stay on the warship?' What am I supposed to say then?" Gallery understood. They would use public pressure to gradually force Charles onto the battlefield. If Charles chose not to go, he would be labeled a deserter, losing public support and everything. "It's not that I want to go to the battlefield," Charles concluded, "but rather than being forced into it, I'd rather volunteer." Gallery stared blankly at Charles. He knew Charles was right. Being forced into battle meant being unprepared, and there might be assassins within the army targeting Charles. By volunteering for the front lines, one could at least request troops they trusted. Gallery was somewhat worried. "You've never been on a battlefield before." "I'm the commander, General," Charles reassured him. "They'll protect me." Gallery sighed and agreed. "Well, this day will come." After a moment's consideration, Gallery said, "I can send a force of 3,000 men to reinforce the Dardanelles, with you as the regimental staff officer." "Yes, General," Charles rose to respond. "Do you have any other requests?" Gallery asked. Charles replied, "I would like 2 weeks to prepare." Chapter 280 Pillars of the Nation. The image below shows the sunken Goliath. Around 10:30 p.m. the following night, Charles, having just finished work, returned to his dormitory as usual, intending to read for a while before bed. In modern times, Charles didn't enjoy reading. He usually scrolled through his phone. But in this era, books seemed to be the only form of pre-sleep entertainment. Just as Charles's eyelids grew heavy and waves of drowsiness washed over him, a rapid knocking came from the direction of Gallieni's rest room, 2 rooms away. Charles was startled awake, then sat bolt upright. He knew the battlefield situation might have changed, and immediately got up to put on his uniform. Sure enough, a communications soldier soon knocked on Charles's door, reporting nervously, "Colonel, Dardanelles Strait report. The Goliath battleship has been sunk." Charles was startled, quickly slipped on his shoes, and while buttoning his uniform, opened the door and followed the communications soldier to the operations department. Gallieni was already waiting there, his uniform wrinkled, seemingly from sleeping in it. That's a good habit, Charles thought. There's no time to take off and put on clothes on the battlefield, this step should be skipped. Gallieni casually handed Charles the telegram, saying, "Half an hour ago, the Goliath was ambushed, hit by 2 torpedoes, and sank within 2 minutes. The cause is still unclear. Most of the 750 crew members are missing and are currently undergoing emergency rescue, but, the rest was unnecessary to say, if a battleship sank within 2 minutes, it would likely suffer heavy casualties like the Bureau 1. The operations department sprang into action, intelligence reports arriving one after another, gradually clarifying the situation. At the time, the battleship Goliath was conducting a nighttime bombing mission under the cover of destroyers when an Ottoman torpedo boat stealthily approached under cover of darkness and launched 3 torpedoes at a distance of less than 100 meters, 2 of which hit, instantly sinking the Goliath. Note, torpedo boats are actually just torpedo boats, but for cost effectiveness. They are powered by coal-fired steam engines, hence the name torpedo boat. They generally have a displacement of around 600 tons. Gallieni's expression was grim. Unlike the warships sunk by mines before, this time the Ottoman Empire had taken the initiative to sink an Allied battleship with a torpedo boat, which was no small matter. This means it's not safe on the warships either, Gallieni said with concern. Furthermore, sinking a battleship with just a small torpedo boat will be a huge blow to the morale of the troops. Then Gallieni turned his gaze to Charles. You need to hurry, they might use this opportunity to condemn you again. Charles nodded. This was a good opportunity for the capitalists. Sure enough, the next day, major newspapers reported this shocking news. Ottoman torpedo boat sinks Goliath with 3 torpedoes. The Ottoman Empire has 4 such torpedo boats. Does this mean the Allies can't carry out bombing missions at night? Will the war situation fall into a stalemate again? Who is David who sank Goliath? The final headlines were alluded to the Bible. The ship's name, Goliath, was taken from the biblical giant Goliath, who was killed by a stone thrown by the young David. The reality was quite similar to the biblical story, and people speculated about who the David who killed Goliath was. Soon after, news arrived that the Ottoman Empire was celebrating their Pillar of the Nation torpedo boat. Its captain was promoted to major, and Lieutenant Commander Feller, who planned the operation, received several medals, including the German Iron Cross First Class. A chorus of voices rose among the people. They can't win this war because of Charles. It's time to send Charles to the battlefield and teach those foolish Englishmen how to fight. Only Charles can win this war. More than 600 kilometers west of Paris lies Brest, home to one of France's two major naval ports, the other being Toulon, and France's largest shipyard. Inside the shipyard, machines roared, accompanied by the cacophony of hammering and shouting, as workers methodically worked around the outlines of several small boats. Wells and Tidjany stood to the side, comparing the design drawings with the actual vessels, discussing points to note. I think the footplate at the bow could be thickened and raised further, Tidjany said, pointing to the blueprints. It would perfectly counterbalance the weight of the engine at the rear, while also providing better cover for the soldiers. It can't be raised any higher. Wells rejected the idea. Otherwise, it would affect the ship's stability. We usually choose to land when the seas are calm, Tidjany insisted. I think the safety of the soldiers is more important, of course, Wells replied, but you don't seem to have considered enemy shells. Tidjany was speechless for a moment. Enemy fire would create considerable waves around the ship. If even a nearby explosion could capsize it, the soldiers would be equally unsafe. Wells smiled at Tidjany, a look of satisfaction on his face. You don't seem to be against the Navy. I've never been against the Navy, Tidjany shrugged. I'm against a useless Navy. Wells nodded slightly. Tidjany had said something similar before, but Wells hadn't believed him. He thought it was just an excuse. How could a Navy be useless? A Navy is essential for colonies, and colonies are essential for a great power. Many were obsessed with a powerful Navy, yet Tidjany claimed it was useless. Now, Wells somewhat understood Tidjany's thinking, for he had witnessed firsthand how Charles was gradually making the useless French Navy useful. Just then, the butler approached Wells with a newspaper. Sir, I think you should take a look at this. Wells took the newspaper and saw the headline. The battleship Goliath is suspected of being sunk by a torpedo boat. Tidjany, who had come closer, also saw it. After reading the details for a while, the two looked up at each other in shock. Wells exclaimed, "This is what Charles meant by developing torpedo boats to protect the coastline." Yes, Tidjany nodded, this is proving Charles's theory correct in actual combat. And this is just a torpedo boat, with a speed of only 35 knots? The image above shows the Ottoman Empire's Pillar of the Nation torpedo boat, whose main armament consisted of 3 torpedo tubes and 2 75mm guns. Chapter 281 Tidjany's Obsession. In the Paris Chamber of Deputies, the members' attacks on Galilee grew increasingly fierce. Do you know what this means? The Allied fleet has had to halt its nighttime bombing operations. The positions our landing forces capture during the day will be driven back by the enemy at night due to lack of artillery support. Our troops are locked in a protracted stalemate with the enemy on the shore. In the long run, the Allies will only face defeat. Galilee coldly observed these members of Parliament standing on their moral high ground, thinking, is this Charles's fault? He had warned the decision-makers time and again against launching this campaign. Now that things have turned out this way, shouldn't they be questioning those who made the decisions? Greevy stood up. Unlike before, he appeared quite calm. He seemed to know the outcome was already decided, and all that remained was to give it a final push. General, Greevy said casually, I understand your desire to protect Charles, but going to the battlefield is every soldier's duty. If you keep Charles constantly by your side, it seems unfair to all the soldiers who suffer and even lose their lives on the battlefield. A chorus of agreement immediately filled the meeting room. Damn it, Galilee cursed inwardly. One sentence had pitted Charles against the soldiers, and would even make the soldiers' families hate Charles. Gentlemen, Armand waved to the councillors behind him, we also hope the military can guarantee Charles' safety. Even in the Dardanelles, we hope he stays on a rear-line warship. They shouldn't be like the Goliath situation. Shameless. Galilee gritted his teeth in hatred. One sentence had shifted Charles' safety to the military. However, Galilee said nothing. He simply stood quietly on the stage, waiting. The meeting room gradually quieted down. They seemed to be waiting for Galilee to give them a satisfactory answer. I'm very sorry, Galilee said calmly. I cannot grant your wish. A chorus of boos erupted in the hall. Galiri quickly added, Charles means that he doesn't want to stay in the safety of the rear battleships, he wants to lead a force on a landing operation. The hall fell silent instantly. Everyone stared blankly at Galiri, many even doubting whether they had heard correctly. Yes, Galiri nodded firmly, he will go into battle, leading a force. So, Galiri turned to Grevy, his words carrying a double meaning. As you wish, Mr. Grevy. Grevy returned a stiff smile, his heart filled with bitterness. Charles would rather lead a force to the battlefield than accept his suggestion to cooperate with him. At the Brest shipyard, Wells and Tidgeny were testing newly produced landing craft. To their surprise, they found it to be virtually problem-free, ready for immediate use upon production. Wells even had workers right on it, acting as soldiers throughout the entire process. The test went incredibly smoothly. The moment the ramp was lowered, the soldiers could rush ashore through the open hatch. Wells was worried, if the enemy's machine guns are pointed at our hatch, the whole ship will be riddled with bullets the moment the ramp is lowered. Don't worry, Father, Tidgeny replied, our warships at sea will provide fire support. Besides, there's never a truly safe place on the battlefield. I'm thinking, Wells hesitated, should we put the hatch on the side? It's useless. Tidgeny shook his head. Once the soldiers reach the shore, there will inevitably be a narrow path between the ship and the riverbank, regardless of whether the hatch is on the front or the side. Wells nodded in agreement. While a side hatch might seem safer, the soldiers would actually be using a smaller passage to reach the shore. At that point, even machine guns wouldn't be needed, a few rifles would be enough to block the passage. Charles, it seemed, had already considered all these problems. Just then, Wells saw the butler hurrying in with another newspaper. Wells frowned. Has another battleship been sunk, sir? The butler's voice preceded him. Charles is going to the battlefield. He plans to lead a force to land in the Dardanelles, Tidgeny exclaimed in surprise. He's going personally, shouldn't he be commanding from Paris as before? Yes, he's going personally. The butler ran forward and handed over a newspaper. That's what it says. Tidgeny snatched the newspaper, his expression shifting rapidly. He glanced at the landing craft and the landing ships under construction, finally fixing his gaze on Wells. Wells understood Tidgeny's meaning and shook his head decisively. No, I disagree, Father, Tidgeny said. Charles might need me. These are ships we produced, and I'm also in the army. I might be the only one who knows about both the Navy and the Army. No, he doesn't need you, Wells replied. Charles knows far more than you do, both in the Navy and the Army. You might be right, Tidgeny had to admit, but he still insisted. However, Charles is the commander. He needs someone on the front lines. God, you actually want to command on the front lines? Wells interrupted Tidgeny. Do you know how dangerous that is? Of course I know, Tidgeny replied. I already tried it when we were surrounded last time. Then what makes you want to go again? Wells's voice grew louder. Because Charles saved your life? That was just a mission, Tidgeny. That's what Charles said too. No, Father, Tidgeny shook his head, slowing his speech, and nodded wistfully toward the landing craft. It's because of them. Because of them. Wells looked at Tidgeny in confusion. These small boats, aren't they something you can have as many as you want? Tidgeny seemed to see through Wells's thoughts. He explained, you don't understand, Father. They're only truly exciting and thrilling when they play a role on the battlefield. I'll never forget the sight of the Charles A-1 tanks appearing before me and routing the enemy. I want to be a witness to them, to be a part of them. Wells was stunned for a moment. He seemed to understand Tidgeny's persistence. At that moment, Wells felt like he was just getting to know Tidgeny. Although they had known each other for over 20 years, and he thought he understood Tidgeny well, he now realized what true understanding really meant. Finally, Wells sighed and replied with difficulty, go, before I regret it. However, the Charles might not agree. In his eyes, you're nothing more than a greedy, fame-seeking playboy. The image above is an aerial view of modern Brest. Chapter 282 How is the commander? The sun was high in the sky when Camille sat by the fireplace, knitting. Perhaps due to her anxiety, she kept making mistakes with her stitches, and when she went back, she kept making the same errors. Soon, the sweater was knotted. She simply tossed it aside and sat down in a chair, staring blankly at the flames. Camille had been restless lately. Every time she went out to buy groceries or chatted with her neighbors, she would hear things like, only Charles can save the Dardanelles, and if Charles were in command, there wouldn't be a problem. Her neighbors might have thought it was a compliment, an affirmation of Charles's abilities, But Camille knew that this idea could push Charles to the battlefield. Therefore, she always acted very agitated. No, Charles has never been to the sea, he knows nothing about the navy, of course he can't command a battle of the Dardanelles, he's never even been on a warship, I'm sure he can only command from land. Once, the easygoing Camille even had a fight with Aunt Cara. At that moment, Aunt Cara said, "God, thousands are dying every day. If Charles were there, this wouldn't be happening." Camille suddenly broke down, yelling at Aunt Cara, "This isn't Charles's fault. Why does everyone think Charles can do anything?" Camille thought it might be a good thing if Charles didn't have these abilities, then he wouldn't be in this situation. But then she thought again, and something didn't seem right. Without these abilities, he might already be on the battlefield as an infantryman, which seemed even more dangerous. Just then, Camille heard cheers outside. She got up and stood at the window, puzzled. She saw her neighbors excitedly talking, as if they had something to celebrate. Camille was delighted. A victory? That was certainly something to celebrate. If they won the war, Charles wouldn't have to go to the battlefield. However, her neighbor Em ran over. Seeing Camille standing at the window, she unconsciously slowed her pace. "Mrs. Bernard," Emma said hesitantly, her expression strange. "Have you heard?" "Heard what?" Camille asked. "I'm not sure if it's true." Emma seemed a little regretful, but she still answered, "I heard that Charles volunteered to go to the battlefield, and General Gallieni announced this news in Parliament." "No, that can't be." Camille's face turned pale instantly. After a moment of stunned silence, she turned and ran to the phone, dialing the tractor factory's number. Just as she was asking, Joka appeared at the door, a look of helplessness on his face. Camille, as if grasping at a straw, turned to Joka and asked, "This can't be true. Charles wouldn't make such a foolish decision." Joka didn't speak, and Camille knew the answer. Camille's face was ashen. She grabbed her hat and scarf from the coat rack and walked out the door. "Wait," Joka chased after her, "where are you going?" "I'm going to find Charles." Camille's tone was firm. "There must be a reason. He must have been deceived, he might be studying how to fight this war." Joka advised, "It doesn't seem like the right time for you to go." Camille froze, not moving for a long time, gazing at Paris like a statue. Charles actually had leave. Gallieni had granted him 3 days. But Charles refused. "It's pointless, General." Gallieni nodded and replied, "Never mind." He assumed Charles needed more time to prepare, but in reality, Charles didn't know how to explain it to Camille and Joka. Charles could only throw himself wholeheartedly into the impending battle, as it concerned his life. As Charles had expected, the landing operation was difficult. The vast majority of the participating troops were colonial forces, the British Anzac Corps, with only the 29th Division being native troops. The French forces so far consisted entirely of the Africa Corps, which had departed from Port Said, Egypt. Everyone assumed the British native troops would fight better than the colonial forces, as they had better equipment, more naval gun cover, and more thorough training. However, the reality was quite the opposite. The Anzac Corps fought resolutely, suffering heavy casualties but ultimately successfully landing and repelling the Ottoman counter-offensive. The British 29th Division, responsible for landings on 5 beaches, either moved slowly and missed opportunities, or failed to land successfully after suffering heavy casualties. In the Battle of V Beach, the 1st Royal Dublin Fusiliers Regiment even seemed on the verge of collapse. The commander of the 88th Brigade personally led the charge but was killed during the second landing. Their opponents, the Ottomans stationed on the coastline, consisted of only a single infantry company of 400 to 500 men. Gallieni specifically placed these 2 examples in front of Charles and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" Charles looked at Gallieni with a confused expression. He didn't quite understand what Gallieni meant. In amphibious operations, perhaps the French offensive doctrine was correct, Gallieni explained, pointing to the documents. The Anzacs possessed a tenacious fighting spirit. After a successful landing, they immediately expanded the battlefield and launched attacks on the enemy, which bought space for their subsequent landing forces. He then pointed to the operational documents of the British 29th Division. On the contrary, the British, even after a successful landing, were hesitant and afraid to attack. Although all conditions were better than the Anzacs, and they faced far fewer enemies, their performance was disappointing. Charles smiled but remained silent. Gallieni was worried that his lack of experience in commanding amphibious operations would lead him astray. On the other hand, Charles had always defeated his opponents by virtue of superior equipment, at least superficially. Therefore, Charles's command style was more like that of the well-equipped British Army. What Gallery didn't know was that while the British equipment was indeed better than the Anzacs, they were still using the wrong equipment. Charles's was completely different. Just then, Tigeny rushed up the stairs to the operations department, panting, and stood before Charles, asking, "Colonel, I heard you're going to reinforce the Dardanelles." Charles grunted in response, continuing to read the documents in his hands. "Take me with you." Tigeny's eyes were full of expectation. "I can do anything. I can be a battalion commander, a company commander, anything." Charles glanced at Tigeny's rank. "It seems inappropriate to have a major general as a battalion commander." "Never mind that," Tigeny said with a forced smile. "How about I be a staff officer?" "I am a staff officer," Charles refused decisively. "A staff officer doesn't seem to need a staff officer." "Then," Tigeny said with a bitter face, "let me command logistics, or ships." "I know a bit about that." Charles turned to Tigeny. "If you need me, how about a regimental commander?" "A regimental commander?" Tigeny was stunned. Chapter 283 Another Western Front. Tigeny could hardly believe Charles was telling the truth. He thought Charles was joking, but Charles was serious. An amphibious landing operation required Marines. However, the concept of Marine Corps didn't exist at that time, not even for the British Navy, which had long used warships to seize colonies worldwide. The British Navy had Royal Naval Divisions, and the 29th Division, currently operating in the Dardanelles, was one of them. But the Royal Naval Division wasn't an independent branch of service or an independent unit. It was an army attached to the Navy. The Navy would use its naval guns to overwhelm the enemy, and then the Royal Naval Division would row ashore to occupy the target. They were landing, not landing. The British believed that as long as the enemy was armed on the coastline, they could be dealt with by naval guns. This was indeed true against natives armed with homemade guns, cannons, or wooden clubs and bows. The sound of naval gunfire terrified them, and the Royal Naval Division could row ashore without resistance. But against a country with guns and cannons, especially one supported by Germany, the outcome was quite different. Tigeny, a naval officer who had also trained at an army academy and even participated in combat, was the perfect candidate to form the Marine Corps. But Tigeny became nervous. "Colonel, while I'm very willing, I'm worried." "Worried you won't be up to the task?" Charles asked. "Yes," Tigeny nodded, his face hesitant. "My training is in land warfare. My only combat experience was the Battle of Cape Town." Tigeny was somewhat embarrassed. This one and only combat experience was a source of embarrassment. Then, Tigeny raised his question. "If I were to be a regimental commander, I wouldn't even know where to begin. I'd be completely clueless." "It's simple," Charles replied. "You just need to think about one thing. Teach the troops how to use the ships you produce, like making an instruction manual, what to pay attention to, when to use them, and so on." Tigeny's mouth gaped open. That's it," Charles nodded. "Next comes the land warfare you've learned." Seeing that Tigeny still had doubts, Charles added, "I heard that you see war equipment in a different light, like works of art." "Yes," Tigeny responded. "Many people don't believe it, but I truly believe it." Then Tigeny quickly explained, "But this won't affect my command, I promise. I can separate it from the war. I know they are two different things. I should keep public and private matters separate." "No, General," Charles interrupted Tigeny, "I don't want you to keep public and private matters separate at all." Tigeny looked at Charles with a puzzled expression, thinking Charles was joking again. Charles explained, "War itself is an art. If you can truly see equipment and war through this lens, you will be an excellent commander, a general." Tigeny was stunned. Charles's viewpoint was novel. No one had ever said it before. Military academies always emphasize the cruelty of war, the unwavering execution of orders and the achievement of objectives, a far cry from the free expression of art. But Tigeny felt Charles was absolutely right. If one considered war from a different perspective, from the angle of appreciating art, one wouldn't be bound by rigid rules, at least not agonizing over whether offensive theory or defensive theory was correct. Then Tigeny understood. This was how Charles commanded. His command was an art unbound by any theory. Perhaps war should be like this. It requires responding to specific situations, not relying on textbooks. If the textbooks say it, the enemy can guess, and that's not war. Tigeny suddenly gained confidence. He stepped forward and said, "I understand, Colonel." "So, the troops I command?" Charles turned his gaze to Galini. Gallieni grunted in agreement, opened a drawer, took out a prepared document, and handed it to Tigny. I transferred the 105th Regiment from the 6th Army. This is a unit that fought in the Battle of the Marne. They have rich combat experience. In the past few days, Gallieni had reorganized this unit, transferring out those with poor combat effectiveness and performance. More importantly, he had conducted a screening, removing officers who did not support Charles from their posts. Gallieni believed the latter was more important, although they were few in number. This wasn't just a matter of command difficulty. These officers could also be bribed by capitalists to target Charles. Tigny took the documents and flipped through them, then looked at Gallieni impatiently. General, when can I see my troops? Anytime, Gallieni replied. They're already resting at the Paris police training base. Great. Tigny waved the documents, excited like a child. I'll go right away. No sooner had Tigny left than Lieutenant Colonel Fernand rushed forward and handed him a telegram. General, another battleship has been sunk, the Triumphant. Gallieni was taken aback. The last time a battleship was sunk was at night, which could be attributed to an Ottoman torpedo boat attack. This time it was daytime. Taking the telegram, Gallieni's expression gradually became serious. He handed the telegram to Charles, confirmed to be a submarine. A German submarine reached the Dardanelles and sank the Triumphant with a torpedo. The telegram was very detailed. Because of the previous sinking of the Goliath, the British battleships were extremely cautious even when carrying out bombing missions during the day. At the time, HMS Triumphant was under heavy alert. It was escorted by 2 destroyers, had anti-torpedo nets around its hull, and its watertight compartments were completely sealed. However, the German torpedoes were equipped with net-breaking devices, easily slicing through the nets and striking the Triumphant. The Triumphant spotted the submarine and, in a panic, opened fire but missed, instead hitting a British supply ship and causing a fire. Soon after, Gallieni received another telegram. Gallieni's eyes held a hint of helplessness. They've withdrawn all their battleships to anchor, which means naval support to the shore might be weakened. Are you still confident in the landing? Charles replied. That depends on the objective of the landing operation. What do you mean? Gallieni looked at Charles with suspicion. Wasn't the objective of the landing operation to defeat the Ottoman Empire or force its surrender? Or, to put it more broadly, to open a new front in the western rear to break the stalemate? Charles calmly replied, if we landed in the Dardanelles without warning and caught the enemy off guard, we might be able to break the stalemate. But now more than a month has passed. Gallieni nodded thoughtfully. The Ottomans are prepared. All they need to do is dig trenches, and that will open another western front. Therefore, the strategic objective of breaking the stalemate is destined to be impossible. If it were achievable, the western front, with its more abundant supplies, would suffice. Why bother transporting troops, supplies, and ammunition to fight in the Ottoman Empire? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 284 Depth Charge. Just 2 days later, another Allied battleship was sunk. This time it was the British HMS Majesty. Its defenses were even more robust, with merchant ships and transport vessels surrounding it in addition to the anti-torpedo netting, along with 3 destroyers and 2 trawlers patrolling the area. Yet, the German submarine still managed to sink it. The Germans were clever. They chose to attack at dawn. The faint light of the sky would make the water appear completely dark, preventing the sailors from seeing through their periscopes, while the submarine could accurately pinpoint a battleship's location by its massive silhouette. The German submarine launched a torpedo from 500 meters away. It sailed through the calm waters, miraculously weaving between 2 merchant ships protecting the battleship, then piercing the anti-torpedo netting and striking the Majesty squarely in the center. Because the explosion was directly in the center, the Majesty sank in just 7 minutes. Fortunately, the Majesty was near the coast and ran aground. Only about 40 sailors perished. People seemed to have grown accustomed to news of battleships being sunk by the enemy. Although newspapers still carried it on their front pages, there was little public discussion anymore. Gallieni simply shook his head. It's hard to imagine that a battleship worth millions of pounds could be destroyed by a single, small torpedo. At that moment, Cobdo handed Gallieni a telegram. General, the Germans may have 5 or 6 submarines in the Dardanelles. How do you know? Gallieni looked at Cobdo with suspicion. This was intelligence that even the Second Bureau couldn't obtain. The British might have, but he hadn't shared this information with France. Cobdo replied, someone saw a German submarine resupplying in neutral Spain. People hadn't paid much attention before, but now they suddenly realized that it was likely a submarine heading to the Dardanelles. In addition, there are several small coastal submarines being transported by train, but these are all just speculation. Gallieni nodded. The intelligence Cobdo received was mostly rumors, but it was extremely valuable when there was no other information available. The enemy only has 6 submarines in total. Charles was somewhat incredulous. And only one large submarine, yet it couldn't make the Allied powers so embarrassed. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand's tone was somewhat helpless. Even one would be a headache, let alone 5 or 6. Charles looked at Lieutenant Colonel Fernand in confusion. The Allied powers fleet had more than 30 destroyers and more than a dozen cruisers. Such a large fleet couldn't stop a single submarine? Lieutenant Colonel Fernand explained, a submarine is only in danger of being attacked the moment it surfaces. Otherwise, no one can do anything to it. Charles was stunned, then realized that depth charges might not have been invented yet. After asking a few more questions, Charles found that this was indeed the case. Warships had very limited methods to deal with submarines, using naval guns or ramming them directly, which might only give them a few minutes of opportunity. Once it's submerged, they could only watch helplessly. Charles hummed in agreement. He thought it was necessary to go to the police training base. Gallieni used the police training base as the training ground for the 105th Regiment because its facilities were far superior to most hastily constructed military bases. Furthermore, the police training base had been consistently training soldiers with mortars and 37mm mortars, so the constant movement of troops meant the arrival of the 105th Regiment wouldn't attract the attention of spies. As soon as Charles's car entered the training base, he heard the roar of engines and shouts. Looking towards the sound, he saw dozens of vehicles on the parade ground, more precisely, modified vehicles, with raised ramps added to their rear, like the ramps on a landing craft. Charles immediately understood that these vehicles were used to simulate landing craft. The rear compartments were packed with soldiers moving back and forth. The vehicles were driven in reverse. Once they reached a slope, the ramps were lowered, and fully armed soldiers, rifles in hand, poured out of the vehicles. Charles thought to himself, no wonder Tigny can still manage to procure so many vehicles at this time. However, Charles quickly realized he had underestimated Tigny. Colonel Tigny, having received a call from the communications officer, rushed to Charles, sweating profusely. Seeing Charles looking at the training ground, he sighed with a guilty expression, we don't have enough landing craft, and besides, this place isn't really suitable for training, so we'll have to make do. Charles was speechless. You call this kind of training making do? Do you know how many people on the front lines are waiting for trucks to transport ammunition and supplies? You easily got over 50, and you call that making do? Charles didn't say anything, just grunted and replied, not bad, but we need to consider another issue. Troops who fight on land year-round might never have been on a ship before. If seasickness affects their combat effectiveness, I've already made arrangements, Tigny replied. Starting tomorrow, they'll go to the Toulon Naval Base for training. Let them spend a few days on warships, Charles. The way this guy talks makes it sound like he can have warships anytime. Are you sure this isn't just showing off? Colonel Tigny hesitated. Are you also going to? Charles chuckled. It's just a boat trip. I don't need it. Charles had experience traveling by boat in the modern world, so he was confident. However, he forgot that warships braving gunfire and waves were completely different from modern steamships sailing smoothly. There's something I need to discuss with you. Charles pulled Tigny aside. You've heard about the sinking of the Dignity, haven't you? Yes, Tigny nodded, then seemed to understand Charles's concerns. If you think we'll have a shortage of landing ships because of this, there's not much need to worry. I've already contacted Rear Admiral Gaplet, and he's decided to send a battleship Gala along with 5 destroyers to provide cover for us, as well as several minesweepers and transport ships. Charles. He was certain that he hadn't made a mistake in choosing this commander, at least in terms of the Navy. He was quite capable, and everything was settled. That's not what I came up with. Charles's expression was somewhat troubled. I was thinking, shouldn't we have something to deal with submarines? Deal with submarines? Tigny looked puzzled. But they're underwater, how can we? Bombs, Charles answered decisively. Bombs that can explode underwater. Tigny's eyes widened instantly. It was indeed a feasible solution, and quite simple at that. So why was it that only Charles could think of it? Chapter 285 Charles's Influence. Use torpedo explosives, Charles said. Tigony nodded in agreement. For the same volume and weight, a mixture of TNT and hexanitrotoluenylamine was 7% more powerful, meaning a greater chance of destroying a submarine. This thing should be as simple and inexpensive as possible, Charles continued. Currently, we can use time fuses. After production, we can test its sinking speed, then estimate the submarine sinking speed to determine the depth, then we can drop bombs in the direction or location the submarine might escape to, Tigony said excitedly. It doesn't even need to hit directly, detonating near the submarine could be successful. Charles was somewhat surprised. This guy actually knew these things? Charles had underestimated Tigony. The principle was the same as with torpedoes. The reason torpedoes could easily penetrate the thick armor of battleships with only a few dozen kilograms of explosives was the enormous destructive power of the explosives under water pressure. Depth charges were similar. Even without a direct hit, the huge shockwave and sudden change in water pressure could cause submarines to leak or malfunction, especially since submarines at this time were quite rudimentary. The drawback was that depth charges were more effective when used in conjunction with sonar. Sonar pinpointed the submarine's exact location and depth, and the depth charge was dropped at the correct depth, with a high success rate. However, sonar hadn't been invented yet, so the only option was to guess the submarine's depth based on its descent direction after detection and then drop the bomb. This method had a much lower success rate, but it was still better than having no means of detection. Besides, the Germans only had one submarine. The other so-called coastal submarines were too small to operate near their bases, and they even needed to be towed to the battlefield by warships. In other words, Charles only needed to deal with that one large submarine to essentially eliminate the submarine threat. At least that was the case in the Dardanelles Strait. At that moment, Wells had just spoken with the Secretary of the Navy on the phone. He, as a father, had been extremely worried about Tigony's peculiar artistic hobby. The training at the Toulon Naval Base and the arrangements for the Gallic battleship squadron on the battlefield were all handled by Wells. Although France did not allow capitalists like Wells to associate with the military, Wells also held the position of a member of Parliament. Moreover, Wells controlled the construction of a large portion of the Navy's warships, so many things didn't need to be explicitly stated, everyone would give Wells face. However, the reason this greasing the wheels went so smoothly was largely due to Charles. The Secretary of the Navy replied, "I understand, Mr. Wells. Actually, you don't need to tell me. I should have arranged these things for you. It is our honor, our pride, and our hope, to have Tigony command the 105th Landing Regiment, and to fight alongside Charles in the Dardanelles for France." Wells was somewhat worried about the squadron's requirements. "I heard that German submarines have been spotted recently, and the British have ordered battleships to return to anchor for safety. Is that true?" "Yes," the Secretary of the Navy replied. "They are currently only carrying out limited reinforcement missions, and will only be deployed in emergencies. Then I hope my requirements for the battleship Gal won't put you in too much of a bind." Wells was somewhat embarrassed. After all, this was war, and to risk a squadron, including the submarine's primary target, battleships, for his son's sake. No, please don't say that," the Secretary of the Admiralty explained. "This is war, Mr. Wells. This isn't for your son, please believe me. We, to be precise, many Englishmen, all hope that Charles can come to the Dardanelles and resolve this problem. The reason for saying many is that there are also those who do not want Charles to get involved. For example, the First Lord of the Admiralty and the First Lord of the Army. If Charles goes to the battlefield and loses, people will say, even Charles couldn't turn the tide. Charles warned you before. If he wins, then Charles saved everything. But from the French perspective, it's a different story. If Charles wins, it will be a glory for France. He has not only defeated the Ottoman Empire but also Germany, and more importantly, he has defeated Britain. Therefore, the Secretary of the Navy fully supported the project, providing whatever was needed. He even worried that one battleship wouldn't be enough, emphasizing in the call, "If the Shire needs it, we can consider sending more warships. Anyway, they can only stay at anchor and can't do anything. However, we must let the British know that it's them who can't do anything, not us, those despicable British. They think they have the right to command our warships just because they have more battleships. We must let them know that's not the case." Wells then realized that a large part of the reason was the Shire. not the Brest shipyard. Hanging up the phone, Wells even felt a little resentful. The Brest shipyard's influence was actually less than the Shire's? Those fickle bastards. Just then, the phone rang. It was Tidjany calling. Is there anything else you need? Wells' tone was full of sarcasm. How about I suggest you take command of the French Navy? No, father, Tidjany replied. Charles just mentioned a piece of equipment that we need to produce within a week. Are you kidding me? Wells almost laughed. Produce it within a week? Rushing to the battlefield, Wells' first reaction was disbelief. This was perhaps related to his stereotype of shipbuilding. Whether it was warships or anything else, it usually took years or even longer. If anything could be produced in a week, it must be junk, Wells thought. Yes, a week, Tidjany said confidently. It's simple. We think around 200 kilograms is suitable, a cylindrical explosive barrel, similar to a gasoline drum, plus a timer fuse. Wells was stunned. It could indeed be produced within a week, and in large quantities. But what's the use of this thing? Wells asked doubtfully. You plan to use it to blow up the enemy's gun emplacements? No, father, Tidjany replied. We plan to use it to blow up the enemy's submarines. Wells jumped up as if pricked by a needle. Blow up submarines? A timed explosive barrel that sinks near a submarine and explodes. God, another simple yet practical invention, and quite inexpensive at that. It costs almost as much as explosives, with no technological barriers whatsoever. Chapter 286 Fleet. A week later, the 105th Regiment finally set sail. Thanks to Wells's efforts and the Admiralty's expedited approval, Charles's reinforcement convoy was quite luxurious. The convoy consisted of 5 transport ships, 2 carrying troops and 3 carrying supplies, 2 of which also carried landing craft and amphibious assault ships respectively. 3 destroyers and 2 Q ships provided escort. These Q ships were armed ships disguised as merchant vessels, a British invention designed to counter submarines. They would have these armed ships masquerade as merchant ships and become alone at sea. German submarines, when encountering these merchant ships, would typically not directly sink them with torpedoes, but instead choose a more cost-effective method, surfacing for close-range attacks, at which point the Q ships would suddenly launch a counterattack. However, these ships proved largely ineffective in actual combat. After suffering a few losses, the Germans stopped making such a foolish move, especially since the mass-produced Q ships all look very similar. Charles was aboard the transport ship Henry, on which Tidjany was also on board. This was Tidjany's suggestion. Before setting sail, he asked Charles with a pleading tone, Colonel, normally you should be aboard the flagship Adventure, a destroyer, faster and safer. But, before he could finish, Charles understood his meaning. You want me to train the soldiers with you? Yes, Tidjany nodded. They are the army. Many have never been on a ship before, or even seen the sea, and now they are going to conduct a landing operation. It will take 5 days to reach the destination, and I hope to use this time to let the soldiers get used to the combat methods of landing craft. No problem, Charles agreed. I will be on that ship. Tidjany chose the Henry because it was a transport ship for carrying landing craft. Tidjany had made preparations before setting sail. 2 landing craft, actual, were placed on the deck. The soldiers entered the landing craft in batches for exercises. But the problem was, the fleet encountered a storm shortly after setting sail, and Charles immediately felt unwell. Charles had a private room, only a few square meters in size, but it contained a bed and a desk with a lamp fixed to it, quite a comfortable environment for the crowded transport ship. But Charles felt he needed a bucket more than anything. He had never known traveling by ship was like this. Dark clouds loomed, a fierce wind howled, and the whole world seemed to be spinning, bobbing from side to side. The ship's tilt seemed to threaten to capsize at any moment. Charles kept telling himself, it's okay, Charles won't get seasick, Charles can't get seasick, but he couldn't hold it in any longer and vomited on the floor. Seemingly hearing the noise, the orderly Adrian knocked and entered. Seeing the vomit on the floor and smelling the sour stench in the air, he immediately understood what had happened. Just a moment, Colonel, he reassured him, it's all right. A moment later, Adrian returned with a rag and a wooden bucket filled with a small amount of water, seemingly to prevent spillage. Charles was incredulous. He asked Adrian with difficulty, you can clean up in this condition? Of course, Colonel, Adrian replied calmly, his hands busy as he spoke. You may not know, but I'm a fisherman's son. I've been used to life on boats since I was a child. To me, all boats are the same. Charles suddenly felt that Adrian's image had grown taller. He was already nauseous and vomiting terribly, while Adrian could still clean the floor. Moreover, his movements were very skilled. He cleaned up the vomit in no time. He returned shortly after leaving with a clean bucket, placed it by Charles's bedside, and whispered, "Don't worry, Colonel, I'll keep it a secret." Charles gave a wry smile. "They'll find out sooner or later. I feel like it'll take at least a few days. The secret is not to fight it," Adrian said, sounding like a wise man. "Relax, feel its rhythm, and tell yourself, I know you're going this way, I know you're going that way. You'll adapt quickly." Charles tried Adrian's method and indeed felt better. Seasickness is essentially a psychological fear. Besides that, it's also because people who are used to the feeling of being grounded on land find it difficult to adapt to the large movements of a ship. Tigeny lived opposite Charles. Charles believed he knew about it, but never came out to check. This was another advantage of Tigeny. He was very shrewd and worldly wise. Charles didn't sleep a wink that night, only feeling better the next morning after the storm had subsided. After experiencing such a storm, Charles found the slight rocking to be nothing, but he still had no appetite. He was so tired that he drifted off to sleep. Unbeknownst to Charles, while he was still heading towards the Dardanelles, a French fleet had already arrived. This fleet, dispatched by Joffre, carried 2 landing craft converted from colliers, commanded by Major General Honoré, and consisted of an infantry regiment of about 4,000 men. Upon arriving at the Dardanelles, Major General Honoré eagerly submitted his operational request to Major General Gapret. "I hope to engage in battle as soon as possible, General. We can help the British capture V Beach." Major General Gapret was somewhat hesitant. "Perhaps you should wait for Charles, he'll arrive in a few days. Then we can consider the landing plan." "No, General." Major General Honoré insisted on an immediate landing. "We should catch the enemy off guard. Everyone knows Charles is on his way. The Ottomans and the Germans know it too." This was true. Reporters had even taken photos at the port when Charles departed, and many people had come to see him off. But this was James's idea. He was determined to launch the attack and achieve victory before Charles arrived. James feared that once Charles reached the Dardanelles and gained control of the French fleet, he would quickly discover the landing ships Clyde and Cadel. If these 2 landing ships were used by Charles, his inventions would pave the way for Charles's success, which he did not want. Major General Gapret could not make the decision himself. He could only consult Major General Roebuck. But there was no need to ask. Major General Roebuck was British, and the French were willing to go to the battlefield to fight. How could Major General Roebuck disagree? With a wave of his hand, he immediately agreed to Major General Honoré's request, even praising him and using this behavior as a model of enthusiasm to encourage others to follow suit. Chapter 287 V Beach Landing. Charles didn't learn of this until he arrived at the anchorage 5 days later. The anchorage was located next to a deserted island about 30 nautical miles from the Dardanelles Strait. The British had discovered through surveying that the water there was deep and free of reefs. Most importantly, they had found a spring on the island. This meant that the fleet could replenish its freshwater supply nearby without having to send it from Malta. Note, at this time, Malta was a British colony, gaining independence in 1964. The British even sent engineers to the island to build roads, transport water, and store water, then distributed water barrels to small boats for daily transport. Upon arriving at the anchorage, Charles was almost shocked by what he saw. Beneath soaring and wailing seagulls, hundreds of ships of all sizes, transport ships, trawlers, and minesweepers, formed a large circle like a harbor on the outer layer, with various types of warships in the center. Destroyers patrolled the perimeter, and Charles's fleet was stopped by destroyers several nautical miles away. They signaled and boarded the ships to verify their identities before allowing passage. Ultimately, Charles's fleet, led by destroyers, was directed to a designated anchorage. Britain, after all, was a long-established naval power, and everything appeared professional. However, in stark contrast was the incurable bureaucracy that had developed over its long period of dominance, a major reason for its defeats. Charles and Tigeny first boarded the battleship HMS Suffren, the flagship of the French fleet, where Rear Admiral Gapret was stationed. Rear Admiral Gapret was a middle-aged man with a beard. He appeared very composed and calmly shook hands with Charles, simply saying, "Welcome, Colonel." He then looked at Tigeny. "Long time no see, Tigeny. I didn't expect to meet you on the battlefield." Tigeny chuckled and introduced him to Charles. "This is Uncle Gapret. If I hadn't insisted on joining the army, I would be his subordinate now. Charles understood immediately. This was someone Tycoon had a connection to. Rear Admiral Gapret led Charles and Tycoon to his office on the island superstructure. Holding his coffee, he glanced towards the Dardanelles Strait. "We just attempted a landing on V Beach, but unfortunately, it failed again." "The British?" Tycoon asked. Charles had the same thought. "No." Rear Admiral Gapret shook his head, then a hint of surprise flashed in his eyes. "I thought you knew they were reinforcements sent by France, just like you." Charles looked confused. Tycoon stammered, "We didn't even know such a unit existed." Rear Admiral Gapret hesitated, then shook his head with a wry smile. He understood. This was a power struggle within the French army. They wanted to outdo Charles. These bastards, still thinking about infighting at a time like this. But what about the Navy? Major General Gapret didn't elaborate on that, directly steering the conversation towards the landing operation. "This landing operation is commanded by Major General Honoré. They brought 2 coal carriers to assist in the landing, each carrying 2,000 men." Gapret flipped through some documents, found a photograph, and handed it to Charles. "It's this kind of ship." Charles glanced at it. It was simply a coal carrier with several exits on the side, a novelty for that era. Tycoon leaned closer, smiled slightly, a hint of mockery in his eyes. "I hope you won't use the same kind of ship for the landing," Major General Gapret said, his eyes showing concern. "No, I won't use that kind of ship," Charles replied. Major General Gapret relaxed upon hearing this, taking a sip of coffee and nodding. "Very good." Unexpectedly, Tycoon added, "We brought a similar one, but much smaller." Major General Gapret froze, looking at Tycoon and then at Charles, his face a picture of utter despair. "It didn't work?" Charles asked knowingly, wanting more information. Major General Gapret grunted in acknowledgement, his face grave as he replied, "They grounded these ships on the shore of V Beach, and under cover of fire, used 2 barges as a bridge between the landing craft and the beach. Then, company after company, the troops landed along this passage. However, just as they were preparing to open the ramps after the grounding, they encountered fierce fire from the defenders. The enemy had already reinforced their forces on V Beach, and it was estimated that there were now over 1,000 men. The soldiers finally managed to descend the ramps, only to become targets for enemy fire. At least half were trapped inside the ships and unable to escape." Tycoon glanced at Charles with concern. Charles knew what he was worried about. Charles's landing craft were somewhat similar to this coal ship converted into landing craft. If there was any difference, it was that Charles's landing craft could get soldiers ashore much faster. Charles waved the photograph at Tycoon and said, "They look the same on the surface, but there's a big difference. You can think from the enemy's perspective." Tycoon pondered for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Colonel. If I were defending the enemy on shore, I could see this coal ship from a great distance because it's so big, and I could also roughly determine its landing location from its direction of travel. After that, its preparations for landing would take at least 10 minutes. As he spoke, Tycoon turned his gaze to Major General Gapret. Major General Gapret replied, "No, it took more than half an hour to prepare. Like I said, the enemy bombarded it with artillery and machine guns. They had to connect the barge to the hull under heavy fire." Tycoon nodded. "More than half an hour is enough time for the Ottomans to bring in machine guns from other directions. By the time they could finally land, the enemy's firepower would have completely blocked them." Charles nodded slightly. This was exactly what he wanted to say. The key to amphibious operations is speed. If you always think that once the ramp is opened, enemy machine gun bullets will rain down on the landing craft, and even a god couldn't stop them. Charles's landing craft's greatest advantage is that it can drop people off at any time and place, before the enemy's firepower has a chance to organize. However, Tycoon seemed to have thought of this as well. He said, "The Ottomans already know that our main landing point is V Beach," which means, Charles gave Tycoon a meaningful look, and the two understood each other without saying a word. Major General Gapret suddenly gained some confidence in the 2 young men before him. Although he couldn't understand what they were saying, they seemed much more reliable than Major General Honoré. At least they could analyze the enemy situation in the course of the war. Chapter 288. The intention lies with Liu Bang. Charles and Tycoon didn't elaborate to Gapret. They chatted briefly before boarding a small boat to visit Vice Admiral Robeck, the fleet's commander-in-chief, aboard the HMS Queen Elizabeth. This was a necessary formality. As a newly joined commander, Charles naturally had to meet the commander-in-chief. Although Charles was mentally prepared, he was still awestruck by the sheer size and imposing presence of the Queen Elizabeth, anchored in the center, as the small boat passed among the warships. Charles had to look up to see her towering island superstructure, with several thick gun barrels extending heavily from the turret, pointing straight into the distance, seemingly ready to blast the enemy to smithereens at any moment. As they drew closer, her massive hull seemed to obscure the sky like a dark cloud, giving Charles an invisible pressure. Tycoon couldn't help but exclaim, "This is Britain's most advanced super-dreadnought, displacing over 30,000 tons, with 8 381mm main guns. It said a single salvo could fire 7,000 kilograms shells." Gappert hummed in agreement, saying, "If you include all the guns, it has over 70 guns. You could say it's a mobile fortress." The image above shows the HMS Queen Elizabeth, Britain's most advanced battleship at the time, commissioned in November 1914, just over 3 months before the events described in the text. The occasion for Lieutenant General Roebuck's meeting with Charles was completely different from Gappert's. He led a group of officers to greet Charles beneath the main guns of the Queen Elizabeth, while also having reporters ready to capture the moment Charles saluted him. "Welcome, Colonel." Lieutenant General Roebuck seemed very sincere. "We've been waiting for you to save us, just as you saved France." A faint chuckle came from the British officers. Charles knew what Lieutenant General Roebuck meant. He deliberately flaunted Britain's power before Charles, speaking with feigned humility to create a stark contrast and mock Charles. Major General Gappert's face showed considerable anger, but he couldn't refute Vice Admiral Roebuck's behavior and could only suppress his rage. Tycoon frowned, seemingly about to rebuke Vice Admiral Roebuck's rudeness. Charles, however, calmly replied, "You're right, General. If it weren't for the loss of so many battleships in your fleet, Parliament wouldn't have forced me here." Roebuck's previously amiable face instantly darkened, and the British officers looked embarrassed, some even glaring angrily at Charles. But they were equally powerless against Charles, unable to refute him. Charles was stating the facts, especially since the successive losses of battleships all occurred under Vice Admiral Roebuck's command. Charles was telling them they had no right to boast. Tycoon chuckled, unconsciously puffing out his chest. Rear Admiral Jeplet glanced at Charles meaningfully. The young man's intelligence seemed to extend beyond military matters. The atmosphere became somewhat awkward. Vice Admiral Roebuck led the group into the conference room on the island superstructure. The conference room was spacious, with a fixed round table in the center, seemingly related to the British Round Table Conference. A portrait of the famous naval commander Nelson hung on the wall, with a British flag and the white ensign flanking him diagonally below, making it appear more like a diplomatic meeting than a military one. The image above shows the British white ensign, symbolizing the Royal Navy. A waiter poured wine for everyone. Charles was somewhat surprised. He thought commanders shouldn't drink during wartime. Rear Admiral Jeplet merely raised an eyebrow, as if to say it was nothing. The British enjoyed a few drinks on warships. "Let me guess," Vice Admiral Roebuck said expressionlessly, looking at Charles. "Colonel, you must be hoping to land on V Beach, like Rear Admiral Honoré, right?" Another sarcastic remark. Just like Rear Admiral Honoré, implying that the French loved to show off, always hoping to land successfully where the British had failed, thus outshining the British. Tycoon had expected Charles to deny it, but Charles readily agreed. "If you want us to land there, General." Tycoon looked at Charles in surprise. Hadn't they already analyzed it? V Beach was no longer suitable for a landing. However, Tycoon didn't speak, assuming Charles was saying this for secrecy. Lieutenant General Roebuck smiled, spreading his hands in a generous manner. "Why not?" The British officers smiled. They understood what Lieutenant General Roebuck meant. If the French were rushing to their deaths for so-called honor, why wouldn't the British be happy? Then General Roebuck asked, "What's your plan? Do you need the British fleet's cooperation?" "No, General," Charles answered confidently. "I believe the French fleet is sufficient. We will arrange everything." Roebuck smiled slightly. That was how it should be. Of course, he wouldn't say that. He smiled and raised his glass. Then, "To our Colonel, to France, to tomorrow's victory." Cheers, cheers. The officers responded cheerfully. Back on the Henry, Tycoon said angrily, "Those arrogant British, we should let them continue to face this situation." "Who says otherwise?" Charles replied. "What?" Tycoon was taken aback. "But you said, we will arrange everything." "I didn't say when," Charles replied. "The British aren't in a hurry, and we shouldn't be either." Then Charles added, "We might have a few more days to let the soldiers continue training. Tidjany said, "Oh," understanding Charles's meaning. But then Tidjany thought of something and asked doubtfully, "Colonel, is what you said about landing at V Beach true?" "Of course we will land at V Beach," Charles replied unhurriedly. Tidjany thought he'd misheard. "But the Ottomans are prepared," Charles countered. "If the Ottomans are prepared, do you think the Germans aren't?" Tidjany was bewildered. "What? If the Germans are prepared, shouldn't they give up?" Before he could finish, Tidjany suddenly understood, staring at Charles in shock. "Submarines. If the Germans are prepared, they'll have submarines deployed near V Beach." Charles nodded. This guy had good comprehension. To land safely, the first step was to eliminate the Germans' only submarine. Attacking V Beach was a perfect opportunity. It was a key area of German submarine focus. Chapter 289. That was Charles's army. For the past few days, Charles's troops had done nothing but occasionally take the fleet out for a short circumnavigation, sometimes sailing towards the Dardanelles to observe the smoke of battle and listen to the gunfire from the shore before returning. In reality, the fleet was conducting training. Soldiers continued using landing craft on board, sometimes sailing to an open, uninhabited area where soldiers would climb rope nets to board, while destroyers simulated searching for submarines and dropping bombs from the appropriate positions. The British, unaware of their activities, assumed Charles was merely putting on a show. Then, Lieutenant General Robeck began to grow impatient. The landing situation in the Channel was becoming increasingly tense, and the tide of battle was gradually turning against the British. The failure of the British 29th Division to successfully land on Beach V was a major blunder, dividing Cape Helles, which should have formed a unified defensive line, into 3 landing sites on the west, Y, X, and W beaches, and 1 landing site on the east, S beach, separated by an Ottoman defensive line. Beach V was the most important landing site. A road ran through it, flanked by hills and high ground, allowing the Ottomans to transport large numbers of troops and supplies to the high ground for defense. This was why the British used their most elite 29th Division to land on Beach V. It was a beach they absolutely had to capture. Who could have imagined that their most elite troops would perform so poorly? If it weren't for the Allied forces' powerful naval firepower, the landed troops might have already been driven back into the sea by the Ottoman Empire. The image above shows the 5 beaches targeted by the British, from left to right, Y, X, W, V, and S beaches. Beach V was extremely important. Its failure almost certainly meant the entire landing operation was doomed. Lieutenant Admiral Robeck stood at the window of the command post on the island, gazing towards the Dardanelles. The gunfire and artillery fire coming from there, along with the occasional Ottoman reconnaissance planes flying overhead, all seemed to indicate a dire situation. General, Staff Officer O'Connell handed Robeck a telegram. "The situation is confirmed. The Ottomans have a plan. They intend to annihilate our forces on S Beach first, and then focus all their efforts on encircling and destroying the landing forces on the other sides. We don't yet know how many troops they have committed." Lieutenant General Robeck let out a dissatisfied snort. He had to admit that the Ottoman strategy was correct. The forces on S Beach were the weakest and wouldn't hold out for long under enemy attack. Once the forces on S Beach were wiped out, the Ottomans wouldn't need to fight on 2 fronts. They could concentrate all their forces to encircle and destroy the landing forces on the remaining 3 beaches. Damn Germans, this must be the plan. After considering for a moment, Lieutenant General Robeck ordered, "Send more soldiers up there. We should expand the offensive before they can react." General O'Connell objected. "There's not much space on the island, and the Ottomans hold the high ground and have a lot of artillery. Sending more troops up there will only result in them being crammed together and dying under enemy fire." This was the awkwardness of amphibious operations. Landing troops did not mean they were safe. On the contrary, this might be the most dangerous moment, because the Navy's guns couldn't bombard reliably, and the landing forces couldn't deliver enough artillery and shells ashore. Thus, the landing forces could only struggle under heavy enemy fire, with no way to retreat. O'Connell hesitated before reminding him, "Unless we continue to commit troops to V Beach, thus diverting the danger from other directions. If successful, it would connect the east and west." Lieutenant General Robeck immediately thought of Charles's troops, which was perhaps what O'Connell hoped for as well. Lieutenant General Robeck asked, "Are the French still not responding?" O'Connell shook his head helplessly. He seemed to want to say something, but opened his mouth and didn't speak. Lieutenant General Robeck frowned and squeezed out a single word through gritted teeth. "Speak," O'Connell cautiously replied. "General, I think this is very likely related to what you said to Charles a few days ago." Lieutenant General Robeck was taken aback, then understood. At the time, he had adopted an attitude of sending the French to their deaths on the battlefield, but now, Lieutenant General Robeck chuckled self-deprecatingly. That Charles, using the same tactics against him, had responded with action. Why not let the British die on the battlefield? "We don't need them," Lieutenant General Robeck said. "We can win this battle ourselves." O'Connell didn't speak, nor did he leave, he just stood there silently. Lieutenant General Robeck understood his expression. He turned back angrily to O'Connell. "Do you really think the French can successfully land at V Beach? They've already failed once. The British 29th Division couldn't do it, and of course the French couldn't either. Otherwise, what would become of the British Empire's reputation?" But O'Connell reminded him, "General, those are Charles's troops. What's the difference between Charles's troops and those?" Lieutenant General Robeck retorted sharply. O'Connell hesitated for a moment before finally replying, "I know something, General. Charles's 105th Regiment is equipped with a large number of mortars. These light artillery pieces can be carried ashore with the troops. They are also well suited for bombarding targets hiding behind bunkers or even behind mountains." Lieutenant General Robeck fell silent instantly. The landing forces desperately needed artillery, but couldn't obtain it. This was not only because howitzers and cannons were difficult to transport ashore by boat, but also because they were ineffective on the battlefield. The enemy was hiding in trenches on high ground or even on the other side of the mountain, making it difficult for the relatively flat trajectory artillery of the British forces to hit their targets. Even if they managed to fire, they would soon be spotted by the enemy on higher ground, and their artillery would be guided to destroy them. Mortars were different. They could hit anywhere they wanted, as long as it was within their range. Furthermore, they could be fired and moved quickly, meaning they had a high survivability. Lieutenant General Robeck, though a naval commander, understood this. He considered it for a while, his expression changing repeatedly, as if he were struggling with his thoughts. Finally, a hint of helplessness flashed in his eyes as he ordered O'Connell, "Prepare the ships." Lieutenant General Robeck intended to personally visit Charles as an apology for what had happened. "I'm sorry, General," O'Connell said, his expression softening. "Charles' fleet has already set sail. However, I think you could speak with General Gapret first." Lieutenant General Robeck gave a wry smile. What else could he do but try to put in a good word with the Gapret? Chapter 290 Rhetoric. Gapret, being of good temper, did not make things difficult for Robeck, but instead discussed the next phase of the coordinated attack with Lieutenant General Robeck in a very courteous manner. However, Gapret stated to Robeck, "General, although Charles is a colonel, I believe it is inappropriate for us to impose orders and battle plans on such a talented commander. This would be tantamount to tying his hands and feet while he fights. Do you agree?" Gapret was essentially telling Robeck in a roundabout way that the battle plan they discussed was not valid and ultimately required Charles's approval. "I completely agree, General," Robeck replied. Although he was slightly displeased, he ultimately did not show it. After all, Charles was quite renowned in France, and if Robeck forced Charles to fight, not only would it be unsuccessful, but it might also introduce uncertainty into the Anglo-French alliance. Charles's fleet did not return until after dark. This was because Tycoon, anticipating that the battle might extend into the night, had added nighttime training exercises. As soon as the fleet returned to anchor and came to a stop, the communications officer reported, "Colonel, General Robeck has signaled that he wishes to board and visit you." Charles smiled. The man had finally couldn't resist. Tycoon, who was on deck reviewing training experiences with his soldiers, also heard the news. He rushed in excitedly, exclaiming, "Wow! I heard that Vice Admiral Robeck of the Royal Navy is going to board the ship in person. Why do you think he wants to come personally? I bet he wants the French army to go to their deaths on the battlefield." Although Tycoon was 7 years older than Charles, he sometimes seemed even more childish than Charles. Charles deliberately arranged a similar reception. He and Tycoon, along with a group of officers from the 105th Regiment, stood in neat formation on the deck to greet Robeck. Under the lamplight, Charles shook hands with Robeck with a sincere smile. "Welcome, General. We await your orders and your inspection." Robeck looked at Charles and the row of French officers before him, who stood with their chests puffed out, being the only 2 machine guns used for self-defense. After a moment's hesitation, Robeck seemed to understand Charles's implication. The British deserved only this level of formality. Feeling humiliated, Roebuck frowned, about to lash out, when O'Connell stepped forward first. "Colonel, we brought you some gifts." With a wave of his hand, soldiers behind him carried a case of wine onto the deck. "I'm sorry, General." Charles glanced at the gift and replied, "I cannot accept such a gift. I do not wish to command a battle while drunk." The French officers behind him unconsciously chuckled knowingly. Roebuck felt somewhat embarrassed. Charles was mocking their unprofessionalism from another angle. Indeed, this was the reality. Although Britain was still the world's leading power at the time, the corruption and bureaucracy within its army had reached an appalling level. The recent Boer War was a prime example. Note, the Boer War took place in 1896. The two small South African nations of Transvaal and Orange had a combined population of only 440,000, while the British Army mobilized forces from its homeland, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, deploying a total of 450,000 troops. It took them 2.5 years to win, and with enormous losses. This war is known as Britain's last fig leaf. Charles's meeting room was piled high with documents, maps, and models. The blackboard was haphazardly covered with training exercises and tactical plans, appearing somewhat disorganized. But Charles was proud of it. After inviting Roebuck and his men to sit down, he gestured to the surroundings and said, "As you can see, General, we are actively preparing for war. Perhaps it will take a little more time." Roebuck fell silent. Since boarding the ship, he had indeed sensed the intense atmosphere of training, indicating that Charles and his men were not slacking off as he had assumed. In contrast, the HMS Queen Elizabeth appeared relaxed and nonchalant, seemingly unconcerned about the impending battle. The Queen Elizabeth was like a high-ranking officer, possessing the thickest armor and the largest caliber guns, yet always operating from the safest position, doing the safest job, bombarding from outside the enemy's firing range. For some reason, Lieutenant General Roebuck's prepared remarks suddenly became difficult to utter. Just as an awkward silence was about to fall, O'Connell interjected with a smile, "We've always known, Colonel. So, we're here to discuss how to coordinate operations. You know, our army has many components, some even don't speak the same language. We're worried that if the 105th Regiment were involved in the battle, it might cause friendly fire." "Yes," Lieutenant General Roebuck said expressionlessly, "therefore, we need to know your plans, when to attack, from where, and so on." This was a very clever rhetoric, ostensibly inquiring about a plan, but actually trying to get Charles to set the attack time. Charles, of course, wouldn't be easily fooled. He replied casually, "I think it's too early to talk about that, General. My soldiers haven't adapted to the climate here, and their training isn't sufficient." "I heard." Charles turned his gaze to Tigny. "The Allied landing forces trained in Egypt for almost a month before attacking the Dardanelles." "Yes," Tigny replied. "It seems they trained for 28 days, but I'm not entirely sure. In reality, they had trained for over a month." But Tigny intentionally used 28 days to satirize the British for taking 28 days after the war began before launching a substantial offensive, while before that, they had only scratched the surface. Lieutenant General Roebuck understood the implication perfectly. His face immediately turned as red as a liver, and he glared angrily at Charles and Tigny. Charles pretended not to notice, maintaining his gentle and calm tone. "General, if your army, after such a long period of training and preparation, still encounters various problems and setbacks during the landing, I think we should at least have prepared for this long." Inwardly, however, he thought, "Playing dirty tricks on me? Don't you know the Chinese are experts at it?" "Yes," Tigny chimed in seriously, "the French army can't possibly be stronger than the British army. They'll likely need even longer training." "Enough." Lieutenant General Roebuck stood up angrily. "A month of training? By then, the war might already be over, Colonel." Charles smiled nonchalantly. "General, we can make a bet and see if the war will end in a month." Historically, this war dragged on until January of the following year, ending with a complete withdrawal of the Allied powers. But Lieutenant General Roebuck believed it would end in another month. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 291: The U-21 Submarine. Finally, after Lieutenant General Roebuck brought in General Giplett to plead his case, Charles finally settled on a timeline for the attack. 5 o'clock tomorrow morning, Charles said, pointing to a location on the map. Attack V Beach, what's the battle plan? General Jetlet asked. No battle plan, Charles replied. We only need fire support from the 6th Squadron of the battleship Gallic, Lieutenant General Robeck cautioned. I don't think that's wise, Colonel. As everyone knows, the Majesty was sunk by an enemy submarine in the early morning. At dawn, it's difficult for us to spot periscopes protruding from the surface, which will put the Gallic in danger, Charles retorted coldly. Otherwise, when do you think is the right time to land? Only when we're ready by daybreak will we have a whole day to attack. Lieutenant General Robeck was speechless. Previously, there had indeed been situations where a landing was almost successful, but then darkness fell, forcing them to withdraw their already landed troops. Otherwise, the understaffed forces might be surrounded and annihilated by the enemy at night. In the end, General Robeck left in a huff, muttering in English, let them suffer a bit, and they'll know war isn't what they think after they've lost something. They launched an attack without a battle plan. Robeck was unaware that Charles's landing plan for the next day wasn't actually for a landing, but rather to lure out the German submarines. The battleship Gal was merely bait. In the dark waters, the German submarine U-21 was slowly sailing in the Aegean Sea. Captain Hirschen hadn't shaved for almost a month, his beard had grown like a broom around his face. His weary expression and prominent cheekbones seemed to speak of the immense pressure of submarine operations. The past month had been enough for the U-21 to become legendary. It had set sail from Wilhelmshaven, Germany, and refueled at Cape Finisterre, Spain. For secrecy reasons, its superiors contacted German merchants in Spain to purchase fuel and lubricating oil, intending to refuel at night and then continue undetected to the Dardanelles. However, Heising discovered that the merchant had purchased the wrong fuel. It was unsuitable for submarines. Left with no other option, the submarine continued its journey without refueling. Throughout the voyage, Captain Heising racked his brains to conserve every drop of fuel, using the most economical speed and taking the shortest route, sometimes even relying on ocean currents. After 18 days, they finally reached their destination. At this point, the submarine had only 1.8 tons of fuel left. Heising later remarked to his men, even if I forget other numbers, even my birthday or age, this number is indelibly etched in my heart. As it turned out, Captain Heising's risk was worthwhile. After reaching the Dardanelles Strait, the U-21 submarine sank the battleships HMS Triumph and HMS Majesty. Its presence even deterred the Allied powers from easily deploying battleships to provide fire support for the landing operation. Ottoman Commander Sanders lavishly praised the U-21 submarine. You single-handedly defeated the entire Allied fleet. Note, Sanders was a German officer who commanded the defense of the Dardanelles Strait, and he became famous for it. These past few days, Heising's nerves were on edge again. He had received a special telegram. We have learned that Charles of France is leading a force to reinforce the target fleet. If we can sink it, it will be a heavy blow to enemy morale. Charles, Heising paused, then waved a telegram to his nearby subordinates, his tone calm. Charles is here, right here. The crew members immediately perked up upon hearing this news. Really? Is he here for an inspection? I really hope to see him. I heard someone saw him on the battlefield on Christmas Day. Yes, my classmate Paul even got his autograph. This was an unprecedented phenomenon. Charles was an enemy of the Germans, yet he had gained a large following of German fans, even though Charles had never met them. Colonel Heising waited for them to finish speaking before coldly adding, he's not here for an inspection, he's here to fight. Our next mission is to sink him if possible. A moment of silence fell, everyone staring at Colonel Heising in shock. Colonel Heising nodded slightly, his voice firm and resolute. I know what you're thinking, and I don't want to do it either, but this is war, gentlemen, a war of life and death. I know you admire Charles and his legendary life, but you must give it your all. It's a soldier's duty. A moment of silence followed, then the crew seemed to have made up their minds. One after another, they answered, yes, Colonel, we will do it. If it were Charles, he would sink us without hesitation. Yes, this is a soldier's duty. Colonel Heising said nothing more. He trusted his men, they were professional soldiers. He simply ordered an inspection of the submarine's equipment and torpedoes so that the submarine could be deployed in optimal condition when needed. However, after searching for several days, Colonel Heising failed to find any worthwhile targets. In fact, Colonel Heising had already encountered Charles's fleet at sea, more than once. but he considered them merely transport ships with a few escorting destroyers, deeming them unnecessary to waste a precious torpedo on a submarine, and thus easily let them pass. If Colonel Heising had known his target was on one of the transport ships, he would probably have regretted it immensely. Soon after, Colonel Heising received another telegram. According to reliable intelligence, Charles's fleet will organize a landing at V Beach tomorrow morning. Colonel Heising's spirits lifted, and he excitedly shouted to his men, "Gentlemen, the big fish is about to bite. Get ready, the moment to change our fate has arrived." What Colonel Heising didn't know was that this was precisely the information Charles had intentionally given him. Charles sent a telegram to the Minister of the Navy, "We will launch an attack on V Beach at dawn tomorrow." "Await our good news?" The Minister of the Navy chuckled. "The arrogant fellow really thinks he can win easily? That's a beach even the British couldn't take." The image above shows a German U-19 submarine, of which the U-21 was one. This type of submarine was the first German submarine to use a diesel engine. Prior to this, kerosene was used, which released a lot of white smoke on the surface, easily revealing its location. Chapter 292 Mobile Defense Zone. At 3:30 a.m. the next day, Colonel Heising commanded the U-21 submarine to appear in the western waters of the Dardanelles Strait. In principle, he didn't need to arrive so early. Colonel Heising had already investigated the timing and patterns of dawn. It usually dawns around 6 a.m., and the dawn time usually occurs about 10 minutes earlier each day, meaning the attack would take place around 5:50 a.m. However, Colonel Heising believed that arriving at the attack position first would be advantageous for the mission. In Colonel Heising's office, he held a pencil and circled the waters in front of Beach V on a map while analyzing for the first mate. French battleships are usually equipped with 305mm main guns, with a range of over 10 kilometers, and 138mm secondary guns, with a range of 8 kilometers. I believe that to provide sufficient fire support for the landing forces, their battleships will enter within 8 kilometers to make their secondary guns effective. Therefore, their operational range is estimated to be in this area. The first mate nodded in agreement. French warships always seem to be at the forefront. It seems that the French Gallic was the one that destroyed the Ottoman ammunition depot. Yes, Colonel Heising smiled slightly, a hint of sarcasm in his eyes. They seem eager to prove themselves, hence their willingness to risk close-range fire. Understandable, the first mate replied. Their warships are outmatched by the British, so they're eager to make a name for themselves on the battlefield. That's probably why Charles came, isn't it? Colonel Heising glanced at the deputy captain and smiled knowingly. Charles won't be that simple, Otto. He was forced to come by the council. Then Colonel Heising steered the conversation back to the main point. If we know the enemy will appear here, we don't need to wait for them to arrive before approaching. We can reach our destination first, then submerge and wait for them. That would be much safer. The deputy captain had no objection, only jokingly asking, "Aren't you afraid we'll be rammed and sunk by the enemy as soon as we surface?" This was indeed very possible. Submarines at that time didn't even have hydrophones. Submerged, they wouldn't even know if enemy warships were operating overhead. Note, hydrophones were invented in late 1915 by a French physicist and a Russian electrical engineer. If they were directly overhead or very close, the submarine would be rammed in two by a passing battleship or have a large hole punched in it by a destroyer before it even reached periscope height. Either way, it would be fatal for a submarine. Colonel Heising calmly replied, "Danger brings reward, and that's the Charles." After the submarine reached its destination, Colonel Heising climbed onto the island superstructure, leaned out, and peered through binoculars at the sea. The sea was calm, a hazy gray under the moonlight, with only the sea breeze whipping the waves against the submarine, causing it to rock back and forth. In the distance, Cape Helles in the Dardanelles Strait stretched out from one end of the continent like a sea serpent, seemingly observing something, with V beached like its forked tongue. Colonel Heising observed for a while, then retreated back into the island superstructure, carefully examining the map with a flashlight. He then ordered the submarine to change positions, finally confirming its location was about 10 kilometers west of V Beach. Satisfied, Colonel Heising retreated back into the island superstructure, closed the hatch behind him, and the submarine slowly submerged, disappearing into the sea like a ghost, as if it had never existed. After the submarine submerged, Heising took a nap at his desk. If there's any safest place in the world, it's when a submarine is submerged. Aside from reefs, Heising can't think of anything that could pose a threat. At 5:20, the vice captain woke Heising precisely on time. Colonel Heising rubbed his tired eyes. took the coffee offered by the vice captain, took a couple of sips, and then issued a series of orders: start the engines, maintain course and full speed, surface to periscope height. If Heasing's estimation was correct, the submarine surfaced precisely in front of the enemy fleet, not a minute more or less. However, when the submarine peered out of the periscope, Colonel Heasing was startled by what he saw. The enemy fleet had actually closed to within 5 kilometers to conduct close-range bombardment of V Beach. The battleship's positions were obvious. He was firing at V Beach from the center of the fleet, the muzzle flashes and smoke acting like navigational beacons, pointing him in the right direction. Meanwhile, Ottoman soldiers on V Beach returned fire, shells sending plumes of water soaring into the sky. The sea was filled with white vapor, indistinguishable as to whether it was gunpowder smoke, water vapor, or exhaust fumes from the warships. Colonel Heasing sensed something was amiss. If anyone else had acted so recklessly, Colonel Heasing wouldn't have thought much of it, but this was Charles. How could he allow his fleet to be put on the defensive from the outset? Wasn't he worried about a submarine attack? Upon closer inspection, Colonel Heasing understood. Against the gray-white sky, he spotted 9 destroyers circling the battleship. A brilliant tactic, Colonel Heasing praised. Truly, Charles, this mobile defense was far more effective than a torpedo net. The circling destroyers formed an invisible defensive network. Any submarine that approached and extended its periscope would easily be rammed and destroyed by these destroyers. Now, Heasing seemed to have only 2 options: either retreat before being discovered by the enemy, or launch torpedoes outside of the Charles's mobile defense perimeter. However, the defense perimeter was at least 2 kilometers away, making a torpedo hit virtually impossible. After a moment's consideration, Heasing gave a deep order: maintain course and speed, submerge, maintain course and speed, submerge. At the same time, Heasing pulled out his pocket watch and noted the time as the submarine submerged. Colonel Heasing was determined to take the risk. He had calculated the time and speed precisely. If the calculations were correct, the submarine would break through the enemy's mobile defense perimeter upon surfacing, appearing precisely at a distance of about 500 meters from the target. With only 2 destroyers in the inner layer, there would be much more time and space to maneuver. What Colonel Heasing didn't realize was that it was precisely the 3 destroyers in the inner layer that were the most dangerous. This was a trap carefully laid for him by the Charles. The battleships were engaged in fierce combat with the enemy at V Beach, which would make the enemy submarines think they had an opportunity. The mobile defense ring deployed by the destroyers was designed to force submarines to appear in the inner ring for close-range attacks on the battleships. The 3 destroyers in the inner ring were modified destroyers brought by Charles from France. They were already equipped with depth charges and awaited the submarine's arrival. From left to right in the image above, they are the German U-22, U-20, and U-19, and the U-21 mentioned in the text. Chapter 293: Charles's invention. Colonel Heasing's calculations were precise. When the submarine surfaced again, it had successfully penetrated the outer defense perimeter and appeared near the enemy battleship. The only shortcoming was that the bow was pointing off target. The submarine was ready with torpedoes, the torpedo compartment was flooded, and it was just waiting for Colonel Heasing to find the right position and give the order to fire. However, just as Colonel Heasing was nervously directing the submarine to turn, several jets of water suddenly burst open in front of the submarine. Colonel Heasing realized that he had been discovered, and these cannons were clearly aimed at the submarine. Colonel Heasing did not hesitate and shouted, "Emergency dive!" Colonel Heasing decisively chose to abandon the mission. He knew that under these circumstances, the torpedoes had almost no chance of hitting, and the submarine would most likely be destroyed by the enemy. Emergency dive! Emergency dive! The orders were passed one after another. The crew's nerves were on edge. They knew that this was a life-or-death moment. If they were delayed by even a second, the entire submarine and its 35 crew members would sink to the bottom of the sea and become fish food. "Hard port!" Heasing immediately shouted the order. "Hard to port!" The first mate quickly understood the command. The battleship's hull was 7 or 8 meters below the waterline, blocking the submarine's path like a wall. If they didn't turn in time, they risked ramming the battleship's heavy armor and losing their lives. The seawater churned amidst the gunfire, and the crew clung tightly to anchor points to avoid falling. Gradually, the swaying lessened, indicating the shells were being blocked by the seawater. The crew breathed a sigh of relief, but Colonel Heasing felt he had been tricked. The submarine had only extended its periscope for a little over a minute. Normally, In such a short time, especially in darkness, the periscope shouldn't have been detected by the enemy. But the enemy had. Not only had they detected it, but they had also opened fire within that minute, with such intense firepower. There was only one possibility: the enemy knew the submarine was coming and had made thorough preparations, waiting for its appearance. Colonel Heising was right. The battleship Gallic was ostensibly bombing V Beach, but in reality, it was conducting anti-submarine warfare. Charles assigned the task of finding the submarine to Captain Meyer, the captain of the Gallic. Charles only informed him an hour before departure. When Captain Meyer heard Charles say there would be a submarine attack, he stared at Charles in shock. "But that's impossible, Captain. How would the Germans know we'd be at V Beach?" "You don't need to worry about that," Charles replied calmly. "You just need to know that the German submarine is coming. The Gallic's mission is to find it and point it out." Then Charles added, "You must be very willing to do that, Captain." Captain Meyer rolled his eyes. Of course he was willing. The result of not being willing would be the Gallic sinking to the bottom of the sea. At the same time, Captain Meyer was also somewhat dissatisfied. He knew, of course, that the Gallic was being used as bait by Charles. However, Colonel Meyer dared not be negligent. He immediately organized the ship's lookouts and sailors, deploying manpower and preparing searchlights on almost every inch of the sea surface in all directions of the battleship, especially on the western side. This was also why Charles wanted the Gallican to approach within 5 kilometers to engage the enemy on shore in close-range gunfire. The battleship was only 5 kilometers from the coast, and the waters on this side were full of shoals and reefs, leaving almost no space for submarines to submerge and navigate. The north and south sides were the bow and stern of the ship, respectively, making it safe for submarines to appear in these directions, as torpedoes would have little chance of hitting such small areas. Finally, only the western side, close to the sea, remained. Hundreds of sailors and lookouts kept watch on the sea surface, many of them using binoculars borrowed from the army. As a result, the submarine was spotted as soon as its periscope peeked out. Then, searchlights were shown on the submarine's position, and the already prepared guns immediately opened fire on it. Subsequently, destroyers carrying depth charges immediately headed towards the location indicated by the searchlights. The submarine's course was easily predictable, everyone saw it. Its periscope traced a long line on the surface before it veered north to avoid a battleship and submerged. Under Captain Meyer's command, the guns ceased firing, and the lookout used searchlights to illuminate the submarine's path and guide the destroyers. The destroyers accelerated to follow, then rolled depth charges, resembling oil drums, from behind. Inside the submarine, Colonel Heising completely relaxed. The submarine had already submerged to 11 meters. Even if enemy artillery exploded directly above it, it wouldn't pose a threat. Charles was a respectable yet formidable opponent. He had actually used himself and the battleship to set a trap. Wait, Charles might not even be on that battleship. This mission might have been doomed from the start. However, Charles was ultimately a step too late. Colonel Heising secretly rejoiced. This was the advantage of a submarine. If the attack failed, they could escape immediately, leaving the enemy with only a few minutes to attack. The previously tense crew members now wore smiles, some even shaking their heads slightly, seemingly still shaken by the near miss. However, boom, several loud tremors shook the submarine violently, like an earthquake, and the unprepared crew members all screamed and fell to the ground. "What's going on?" Colonel Heising, who had fallen to the ground, struggled to his feet from the pile of men. "Enemy artillery," the vice captain asked in horror. "Impossible," Colonel Heising replied. "What kind of artillery could reach this depth?" Everyone fell silent, because no one knew what it was. But one thing was certain, it could hide a submarine. Boom, 2 more explosions rang out, and the crew members fell to the ground again. This time they were certain, it wasn't a coincidence, but rather the enemy deliberately hunting down the submarine. Colonel Heising's mind went blank. He had many questions. How did the enemy know their location? What were those things that could hide a submarine? Who invented them? Wait, Charles. Colonel Heising swallowed hard and said, "That might be a new piece of equipment invented by Charles." The crew members instantly turned pale. A new piece of equipment invented by Charles, equipment that could blow up a submarine. Did that mean? Just as the thought crossed their minds, 2 more loud explosions rang out. Then came the panicked shouts of the crew at the rear. "The engine room is flooding. The engine room is flooding." Colonel Heising realized the battle was over. With the engine room flooded, If they didn't surface, it meant they would never rise to the surface. Chapter 294 The Submarine's Fate. Surface immediately, Colonel Heasing shouted, his voice trembling with fear. Immediately, Europeans, including the Germans, knew that once the outcome of a battle was irreversible, they would choose to preserve their own lives and those of their soldiers. Colonel Heasing was no exception. He chose to surrender. Unfortunately, the submarine couldn't raise a white flag underwater, and Colonel Heasing didn't know what was attacking it. If he could raise a white flag, the destroyers on the surface would immediately cease their attack. If Colonel Heasing knew that it was a depth charge and its method of attack, he should have ordered the submarine to stop or change course, causing the destroyers to misjudge its location and drop bombs elsewhere. But war has no what-ifs. Under Colonel Heasing's orders, the U-21 submarine surfaced while simultaneously moving at full speed, as this would allow it to reach the surface more quickly. However, 3 destroyers were overhead, lined up at 9.5 knots, continuously rolling bombs 10 meters deep from their sterns to the surface. Note, the U-19 submarine's maximum underwater speed is 9.5 knots. The outcome was predictable. Just as Colonel Heasing ordered the communications officer to destroy the cipher machine and classified maps and documents in preparation for surrender. Boom, the submarine rocked violently, seawater gushing into it amidst the screams and cries of the crew. Colonel Heasing sighed inwardly. It was all over. They didn't even have the chance to surrender. The sun rose above the sea, and in just a few minutes, the world transformed from gray to bright. The battleship Gull continued bombarding the enemy on V Beach, but almost everyone on board, including Captain Meyer, had their eyes fixed on the 3 destroyers operating on the surface. They threw explosive barrels into the sea, and soon plumes of water shot into the sky, revealing glimpses of fish with bright white bellies. "What are they doing?" the first mate asked sarcastically. "They think they can blow up a submarine like this? I think it's a good way to fish. We can have an extra meal tonight." Laughter rippled around them. They shared the first mate's opinion that this method of dealing with submarines was too primitive. Did they really think a barrel of explosives could destroy a submarine? But Captain Meyer's expression was serious. He carefully observed the sailors' actions through his binoculars and seemed to understand the use of the barrel of explosives. The destroyer followed the possible escape route of a submarine, dropping bombs at a predetermined depth to detonate underwater. Although primitive, it was simple, cheap, and potentially practical. "Charles," Captain Meyer asked the first mate, his eyes still fixed on the destroyer. "If that was Charles's invention, would you still think it was for fishing?" The first mate didn't speak, as Charles's inventive talent was well known. But a disdainful smile remained on his lips. Charles didn't understand the Navy, the vice captain thought. Naval equipment reflected a nation's most advanced technology and strongest industrial capabilities, completely different from the Army's ability to invent a simple grenade and make it popular. Now, Charles was planning to invent a grenade in the Navy. Reality would slap him hard in the face. Suddenly, someone shouted, their voice filled with surprise. "Look, what's that?" Someone replied, "It's oil, submarine fuel." "God!" They sank the submarine. A cheer erupted around them. The vice captain frowned. He still held on to the belief that a little oil didn't mean the submarine had been sunk. However, soon some debris floated to the surface, books, boxes, backpacks, all sorts of random things, and finally, several corpses drifted up. The cheers grew even louder, even the gunfire ceased, and everyone waved in salute to the destroyer. "Well done, you succeeded, you taught Germany a lesson, good job, you've solved a major problem." It was indeed a major problem, even strategically significant. The Allied battleships dared not provide fire support for the landing forces because of the submarine's presence, which was one of the reasons for the repeated failures of the landing forces. Tijani was as happy as a child, excitedly hugging Charles and kissing him on the cheek, shouting, "We succeeded. You're amazing, Colonel. Incredible. You're invincible, you're omnipotent." Charles wiped his face in disgust, secretly considering whether he should keep his distance from this guy in the future. "What should we do next?" Tijani panted, his eyes still shining with excitement, seemingly wanting to press the attack ashore. "What else can we do?" Charles replied calmly. "Today's mission is complete, go back." A hint of disappointment flashed in Tijani's eyes, but he still responded and relayed the order. At this moment, Lieutenant Admiral Robeck was having breakfast with Captain Forbes in the mess hall of the HMS Queen Elizabeth. Breakfast wasn't lavish: steak, red wine, caviar, and some fruit. But for the troops fighting on the front lines, it was a luxury. Even fresh water and bread were rationed. "Do you think Charles will successfully land on V Beach?" Captain Forbes asked, skillfully cutting his steak. "I'm not sure," Lieutenant Admiral Robeck shook his head. "It's complicated. Sometimes I hope he succeeds, sometimes I hope he doesn't." Captain Forbes nodded. He understood Lieutenant Admiral Robeck's dilemma. If Charles successfully landed, it meant the French army was stronger than the British. If Charles failed, it meant the landing operation was still in trouble, and they might even suffer heavy losses and a counterattack by the Ottomans. After a moment's consideration, Colonel Forbes suggested, "If we let HMS Queen Elizabeth provide fire support for the landing forces, I think we might succeed." "No," Lieutenant General Robeck interrupted Colonel Forbes, his tone firm. "German submarines are active, Forbes. With that submarine threat, HMS Queen Elizabeth must not be deployed." Lieutenant General Robeck added, "HMS Queen Elizabeth is the pillar of everyone's spirit. She is the symbol of the Royal Navy. She represents Britain, and she cannot be in any danger." "Yes, General," Colonel Forbes replied. Lieutenant General Robeck had emphasized this many times. If HMS Queen Elizabeth were sunk, it would severely damage the morale of the Allied forces and even cause Britain to lose face. At that moment, O'Connell rushed into the mess hall excitedly, almost shouting, "General, he did it. He succeeded." "What?" Lieutenant General Robeck looked at O'Connell in confusion. It had only been a little over an hour since HMS Gull opened fire, and they had already successfully landed? Chapter 295 Charles's Telegram. Vice Admiral Robeck was quite surprised by O'Connell's answer. He had even forgotten to chew the beef in his mouth. After a long pause, Vice Admiral Robeck hurriedly swallowed his food. "Are you sure? They sank the submarine?" "Yes," confirmed. O'Connell nodded confidently. "They salvaged the floating debris and bodies," confirmed. "They were German submarine crew members, and they even got more detailed information from the documents." Captain Forbes was both surprised and delighted. This meant that the Queen Elizabeth wouldn't have to stay at anchor and be used as a decorative object. Who wouldn't want to play a role with such a battleship? More importantly, every time Captain Forbes encountered his colleagues, they would look at him with a strange gaze and expression. Captain Forbes knew what that meant, enjoying the best benefits while fighting the safest battles. What an enviable captain. "What did he use to destroy the submarine?" Captain Forbes asked curiously. "It's supposedly a bomb." O'Connell handed over the telegram. "This bomb is released from the stern of the destroyer, it sinks into the sea and explodes. They followed the submarine's escape route and finally succeeded in destroying it." "Is it Charles's new invention?" Colonel Forbes asked again. "Of course," O'Connell nodded heavily, but added, "It should be." Actually, he wasn't sure, because the telegram hadn't said so. Colonel Forbes realized something. He glanced at Vice Admiral Robeck sitting opposite him and didn't dare say anything more. O'Connell suddenly noticed that Vice Admiral Robeck's expression was off and quickly shut his mouth. Vice Admiral Robeck turned his head, staring blankly at the food in front of him. Vice Admiral Robeck realized he had been tricked. Charles's objective in this operation wasn't to land on V Beach at all, but to destroy the submarine. Although Charles had succeeded, he had allowed the previously trembling and walking on thin ice battleships to operate freely. However, Charles made Lieutenant General Robeck look like a fool, humiliating him in front of everyone. Just moments ago, Lieutenant General Robeck was speculating with Forbes about whether Charles's landing would be successful. "Have they returned?" Lieutenant General Robeck asked coldly, his face frosty. "Yes." O'Connell sat up straight. "About an hour and a half back at anchor, he disrupted the entire operation plan." Lieutenant General Robeck snorted. "When he returns, bring him here to see me, General." O'Connell started to say something, but was stopped by Lieutenant General Robeck's sharp gaze. "I cannot tolerate him," Lieutenant General Robeck stated righteously. "This is an army, he must obey orders. Otherwise, others will follow his example." "Yes, General," O'Connell responded helplessly. But inwardly, he thought, "They are also French troops, our allies. Although nominally under your command, you cannot punish Charles of France using the military law of the British Empire. If you do, what will the French military think? What would the French people and military think? What would the French government think? Did you intend to single-handedly undermine the Anglo-French alliance?" But Lieutenant General Robeck was in a fit of rage, and O'Connell knew that if he objected now, he would likely be immediately sent to the island to command infantry operations. Soon, the news reached France. The first to receive the telegram, of course, was the Paris Garrison Command. During this time, without Charles by his side, Gallieni felt uneasy. He would sometimes call Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, analyze the battle situation. "How do you think the French army should land?" Lieutenant Colonel Fernand stammered, answering with difficulty, "General, perhaps only Charles would know. Besides, I graduated from the St. Cyr Military Academy, and I'm not very knowledgeable about naval warfare." "You can say you know nothing, Lieutenant Colonel, I understand." Gallieni was somewhat annoyed. He complained, "Charles never went to military school, yet he knows everything." Lieutenant Colonel Fernand looked troubled. There weren't many Charleses in the world who could compare to his talent. But he didn't dare say it aloud, though it was true. It was still confrontation. Gallieni waved his hand impatiently, signaling Lieutenant Colonel Fernand to go about his business. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, as if granted a pardon, immediately ran off, hiding far away for a fear of being seen by Gallieni. The other staff officers did the same. Whenever Gallieni glanced around, the entire command staff would let out a soft gasp, lower their heads, and pretend to be busy, when in fact they did nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand sighed inwardly, "Colonel, please come back soon. Your presence has raised the general's expectations of the staff. The general no longer values us." Suddenly, someone shouted excitedly, "Charles' telegram." Gallieni instantly turned his gaze towards the direction of the voice. His previously worried face immediately brightened, his eyes gleaming with excitement. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. This meant that the general wouldn't torment them for at least the next few hours. After the communications officer decoded the telegram, the staff officer exclaimed in surprise, "Charles has successfully sank a German submarine." "Sink a submarine?" Gallieni was taken aback, then chuckled softly. "That little guy always surprises us." Gallieni then asked, "What did he use to sink it? Was it a new invention?" "Yes, General," the staff officer replied. "Something called a depth charge." Gallieni grunted and nodded in satisfaction. If Charles didn't invent something, he wouldn't be Charles. Another military order would be added, but that was a matter for the Navy. The news wasn't immediately disseminated. This was to pave the way for the operation of the honors daily. Cobdo acted quickly, analyzing the entire operation, the strategic significance of sinking the submarine, and the capabilities of the German submarine, filling an entire page. It was just past 8 in the morning. The newspaper staff had just gone home to rest after a night's work, but Cobdo woke them all up to work overtime. The newspapers sold out instantly upon hitting the market, and all of France was in an uproar. Everyone in the streets was talking about Charles's victory. "See? I knew Charles could outmaneuver the British. Those foolish British, they have no idea how to fight. They should have made Charles commander-in-chief. It would be good for everyone." The Minister of the Navy also heard the news, and he was puzzled. Charles had used a feint, so why had Tycoon sent him a telegram yesterday saying they were going to land on V Beach today? Could it be that someone close to him? No. Impossible. It must have been a leak from the British Navy. Chapter 296 Naval Codebook. Charles's fleet returned to anchorage to heroes cheer. French soldiers, British soldiers, Australian soldiers, New Zealand soldiers, and even members of the Africa Corps all crowded to one side of the passageway, waving whatever they could find at the fleet, national flags, handkerchiefs, rags, and shouting in various languages, "Welcome back in triumph, well done, Charles, a brilliant battle, perfect command." Tycoon watched the fleet and the crowd receding with the ships, his eyes filled with a mixture of bewilderment, excitement, and overwhelming flattery. He had always pursued the art of war. The moment when equipment proved its worth and victory was achieved, now, he found that this feeling of being recognized and immersed in cheers wasn't so bad after all. Charles was somewhat used to it. He looked expressionlessly at the cheering crowds on both sides, calmly raising his hand in response. The crowd seemed to interact with Charles, the cheers instantly reaching another climax. Soon, Charles saw a small wooden boat waiting at the anchorage, with several British soldiers standing on it, preparing to board. Tycoon noticed this too, and excitedly told Charles, "It's the communications officer from the Queen Elizabeth. They must be bringing us congratulations and awards." "Is that so?" Charles smiled slightly. "If it were congratulations and awards, it shouldn't be the communications officer. It should at least be a colonel-level staff officer or even Lieutenant General Robeck himself." In the conference room on the island superstructure of the Queen Elizabeth, the atmosphere was rather strange. Lieutenant General Robeck had a smile on his face, but everyone could tell that his smile was forced. The officers remained silent, occasionally glancing at Lieutenant General Robeck, seemingly trying to discern his attitude. General Jetlet strode in, arriving late because General Robeck hadn't notified him of the meeting. He first went to Charles's transport ship, only to learn that the two had been summoned here by Lieutenant General Robeck. Upon seeing Charles Antigone, General Gappert's face lit up with a proud smile, and he shouted from afar, "Well done, Charles Antigone, I reported your victory to the Admiralty, and the Minister is very satisfied with your performance. The Minister said that this is the fighting style of the French Navy, we never back down in battle, and if anything stands in our way of victory, we'll deal with it first." The British officers' faces instantly turned grim, especially Vice Admiral Robeck, because it was he who had ordered the battleships to provide limited reinforcements, which Gappert had called backing down in battle. After General Gappert sat down, Lieutenant General Robeck cleared his throat and forced a smile as he looked at Charles. "Congratulations on your first victory, Colonel." "But," Lieutenant General Robeck's voice turned low, "as a soldier, you should understand that orders are absolute. Your actions today disrupted our entire operational plan." O'Connell took over, his tone calm, a slight smile on his face. "Yes, Colonel, I'm not sure if you know that the troops at Cape Helles are waiting for you. The troops at W Beach and S Beach are launching an attack on the enemy to support your landing, but instead of landing, you chose to bomb the submarines." O'Connell was trying his best to justify Robeck's anger. He believed that only in this way could he maintain relations with Charles and even France. "Is that so?" Charles calmly countered. "Then why haven't I heard about this so-called cooperation before?" Lieutenant General Robeck answered without hesitation. "That's part of our battle plan," Charles grunted, looking at General Robeck with a cryptic, mocking smile. Lieutenant General Robeck suddenly realized he had fallen into Charles's trap. If the British battle plan didn't need to be told to Charles, then Charles's battle plan certainly didn't need to be told to the British. Therefore, Charles wouldn't be responsible for the so-called losses at Cape Helles. This cunning bastard, he probably already thought of this loophole. Robeck regretted it. He should have pretended to present a battle plan to this arrogant Frenchman before the battle. Now, all he could do was seize on the disobedience accusation. However, just as Lieutenant General Robeck was about to speak, General Gappert preempted him. "My mistake, Lieutenant General." General Jetlet apologized to Lieutenant General Robeck with a smile. "I knew about the whole plan. They originally wanted to discuss it with you. But for security reasons, I decided not to make the plan public. It turned out to be the right decision." Lieutenant General Robeck was stunned. If General Jetlet knew about the plan, then Charles wouldn't even be considered disobeying orders. Just as Lieutenant General Robeck was thinking of what charge he could use to suppress Charles's arrogance, a staff officer rushed in and handed Lieutenant General Robeck a telegram. Lieutenant General Robeck glanced at the telegram, then looked at Charles in shock, then at the staff officer, seemingly confirming the authenticity of the telegram. The staff officer nodded slightly. Lieutenant General Robeck gritted his teeth, finally sighed, and reluctantly softened his expression. The telegram was from the Minister of the Navy, containing only a few simple words: "Cooperate with Charles, do not interfere." This puzzled Lieutenant General Robeck greatly. It was precisely the Minister of the Navy who had initially targeted Charles. Because if Charles won, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who had spearheaded the Dardanelles campaign, would be affected. Everyone would think that Charles had accomplished what he couldn't. Vice Admiral Robeck couldn't understand what had caused the First Lord of the Admiralty to suddenly change his mind and support Charles's unauthorized actions. The answer was simple. After the naval victory, Charles sent a telegram to General Winter: "Sink the submarines, offshore. The Germans may not have time to destroy the codebook." General Winter was at Ypres headquarters discussing the battle with his staff. He believed that terrain like Ypres required more naval and army support to minimize unnecessary casualties and hold the muddy ground. Upon receiving the telegram, he jumped up as if pricked by a needle. My God, the German naval codebook! General Winter knew how important this was. At this time, the blockaded German fleet was stirring. Britain had sent a large number of warships to the Dardanelles, which was clearly the best opportunity for the German fleet to break out. The British Navy was anxious about this. They didn't know when the Germans would launch a surprise attack on the blockaded fleet. If the Allied powers were to obtain the German naval codebook at this point and use it to decipher the German naval telegrams, it would mean that the German operation had failed before it even began. Chapter 297. We are all fans of SEAL. Therefore, Charles practically held the fate of the British Royal Navy, and even the fate of the entire Allied powers, in his hands. This was far more significant than the Dardanelles Strait. Even with the First Lord of the Admiralty's stubbornness, he dared not risk the safety of the entire Royal Navy. Vice Admiral Roebuck was unaware of this. After hastily ending the meeting, he suppressed his displeasure and called the First Lord of the Admiralty, asking, "What do you mean by cooperating with Charles? Shouldn't it be Charles cooperating with me? I thought he was the commander-in-chief of the fleet." The First Lord of the Admiralty was speechless upon receiving the telegram. The fewer people who knew about the German naval codes, the better. Once the intelligence leaked, the Germans' code-changing efforts would be in vain. Therefore, the First Lord of the Admiralty decided that even Vice Admiral Roebuck should not know. The First Lord of the Admiralty also considered another possibility, informing Vice Admiral Roebuck and then having him retrieve the codebook. But this seemed unrealistic. The French Navy had sunk the submarine, and they knew the exact location, while the British Navy did not. This might not be difficult, after all, it was in that area of water. But what would Charles think if he knew? Would he bypass him to retrieve it? If they angered Charles, and he indiscriminately bombarded the submarine's location with depth charges, completely obliterating it and sending it swept away by the ocean currents, the British would have no chance of finding the codebook. The First Lord of the Admiralty was convinced Charles would do such a thing. Because the codebook was dispensable to France, but crucial to the survival of the Royal Navy, Charles had ample reason to do so. Thus, the Royal Navy had a weakness in Charles's hands and could only yield. To Vice Admiral Roebuck, the First Lord of the Admiralty could only give a lukewarm reply. Judging from the current situation, Charles's command is advantageous in the Dardanelles, and we unanimously believe that the fleet should fully consider Charles's advice. The First Lord of the Admiralty's words were intended to convey the helplessness and seriousness of the situation to Vice Admiral Roebuck. That was enough. But Vice Admiral Roebuck was deeply stung by the phrase Charles's command. What did this mean? Did the commander-in-chief have to accept Charles's command? No, that was impossible. Blinded by rage, Vice Admiral Roebuck immediately replied with a telegram, "In that case, I believe I am no longer suitable to serve as commander-in-chief of the fleet. Please appoint someone else." Since he had no command authority anyway, he figured it was better to be in this position. Vice Admiral Roebuck's words were somewhat defiant. He thought they would soften the Minister of the Navy's tone and give him a way out. However, Vice Admiral Roebuck was mistaken. He didn't understand the subtext of the Minister of the Navy's telegram. Upon hearing Vice Admiral Roebuck's words, the Minister of the Navy genuinely considered replacing him. Vice Admiral Roebuck and Charles had a strained relationship, even to the point of being irreconcilable, which could potentially threaten the security of the codebook's retrieval. Furthermore, the fewer people who knew about this, the better, and General Winter was one of those in the know, and he had always maintained a good relationship with Charles. So why not appoint General Winter as Commander-in-Chief? As for General Winter being a Rear Admiral, that was easy, just promote him to Vice Admiral. After all, Roebuck had also been promoted from Rear Admiral to Vice Admiral before becoming Commander-in-Chief. Perfect. On the other end, Lieutenant General Roebuck waited a while and, seeing no reply, felt smug, thinking his coup had succeeded. Lieutenant General Roebuck thought, they certainly didn't expect him to resign. A last-minute change of commander had already happened once, another would definitely affect morale. Moreover, he had been carrying out the offensive according to the Minister of the Navy's orders, and they had said they would be responsible for any losses. Unexpectedly, at that moment, the staff officer handed Lieutenant General Roebuck a telegram with a look of astonishment. Lieutenant General Roebuck took the telegram and read, "Your application has been approved, General. The new Commander-in-Chief will arrive as soon as possible. Until then, please complete the handover procedures." Lieutenant General Roebuck was stunned for a long time, looking at the telegram again and again, then glancing at the staff officer with a suspicious look. The staff officer looked helpless. "It's true, General. It's from the Minister of the Navy. We've confirmed it." Vice Admiral Roebuck instantly drained of color. He couldn't believe how foolish he had been. He never imagined they would remove him, the Commander-in-Chief, for Charles's sake. General Winter felt fortunate upon receiving the appointment. He knew it was because of Charles, otherwise, someone like him, a young and ambitious vehemently opposed to the Minister of the Navy, would have had almost no chance of promotion. However, compared to the codebook, these were insignificant. General Winter made a few quick preparations and hurriedly set off. He flew to Egypt, then transferred to Malta, and finally took a seaplane from Malta to the anchorage. The next afternoon, when General Winter arrived, Vice Admiral Robeck had already been relieved of his command and transferred back home. Vice Admiral Robeck left dejectedly. Only a few officers came to see him off. The sailors looked at him with contempt, some even spitting at his retreating figure. They knew Lieutenant General Robeck was attempting to punish Charles for insubordination. This is not worthy of sympathy. We don't need generals like this. I have never agreed with the Admiralty's orders as much as I do now. Incompetent generals, all they care about is their own power and face, completely disregarding the lives of their soldiers. The last sentence is the crux of the matter. Lieutenant General Robeck's actions were not fundamentally wrong. The army should indeed follow orders, not act independently. But the key question is whether this independent action is advantageous or disadvantageous to the war. If advantageous, it's decisive and swift, seizing the opportunity; otherwise, it's disobeying orders that deserves punishment. The commander-in-chief should be able to distinguish these distinctions. But the soldiers don't consider these things. They only know who can win, who can save their lives, and they will support them. After General Winter took over command of the General Staff, his first act was to meet Charles aboard the transport ship Henry. He smiled and hugged Charles, then politely shook hands with Tigeny. "It's an honor to meet you, General Tigeny. I've heard some of what you've done. You fought a spectacular battle," Tigeny exclaimed. "Wow. You seem much easier to get along with than that General Robeck." "Of course," General Winter laughed heartily, "because we have one thing in common." General Winter turned his gaze to Charles. "We are both fans of Charles." The image above shows the HMS Ark Royal, a seaplane carrier converted from a British ocean liner. Completed in December 1914, it immediately headed for the Dardanelles. Its seaplanes were primarily used for reconnaissance. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 298. That's Charles. The Gallipoli Peninsula echoed with the roar of cannons. At the end of the Saros Gulf lay the small town of Boracay. Most civilians had been displaced by the fighting. Those coming and going were mostly soldiers, logistics troops, and wounded soldiers being carried down from the front. The headquarters of Lehman von Sanders, commander of the Ottoman Fifth Army, was located here. He chose a simple, ordinary house, nestled in a valley for shelter from the artillery fire. The image above shows Lehman von Sanders, a German general, serving as Ottoman military advisor and commander of the Fifth Army. Sanders stood at his desk, silently staring at the map before him, his brow furrowed. Before this, the Ottoman army could only be described as evenly matched with the enemy. But with the sinking of the U-21 submarine, Allied battleships could now unleash their full force, launching a fierce assault on the shore in unison with enemy landing forces. The scales of victory were once again tipping in the Allies' favor. "We cannot afford to lose," Sanders murmured to himself. "If the Dardanelles falls, the war will end in our defeat." But what could he do now? Sanders considered several options. Torpedo boats. That seemed unlikely. They could only launch night raids. This would have little impact on the Allied offensive, as they mostly attacked during the day and defended themselves with barbed wire at night. Submarines? The remaining 5 submarines, due to their small size and limited range, could only operate in the Sea of Marmara and its straits, insufficient to deal with the enemy battleships operating in the Aegean Sea. Therefore, there was only one option. Sanders ordered his staff, order the troops to split into 2 groups, one for nighttime harassment, the other for daytime attack. "Yes, sir," the staff officer replied and relayed the order. Less than half an hour after the order was given, Colonel Baher, commander of the Ottoman 20th Division, rushed into the command post. "General, I think your order is inappropriate." Colonel Baher, who had studied in Germany, spoke in German, his accent broken but his tone resolute. "This is our land, we know everything here. I believe we should engage the enemy during the day and attack at night." "Is that so?" Sanders calmly countered. "Then, how have your nighttime attacks been going?" Baher fell silent. The Allied forces possessed superior firepower. They had constructed trenches and erected barbed wire. Once the Ottoman army launched an attack, they would fall in droves under their machine guns. The front lines were now littered with the corpses of Ottoman soldiers, many already rotting and stinking, but they remained there. After a moment's hesitation, Balher said, "Even so, we cannot attack during the day. Enemy naval guns will inflict massive casualties on our troops. It is precisely because of the battleships that you are being ordered to attack during the day," Sanders interrupted Balher. Balher looked at Sanders with bewilderment. Wasn't this sending Ottoman soldiers to their deaths? Sanders didn't rush to explain. Instead, he asked, "What's the status of the fortifications on the high ground you're stationed on?" "The trees have been bombed flat by the enemy," Balher replied. "The fortifications we painstakingly build every night are always destroyed by the enemy the next day. Even the land is shattered and can't be reconstituted." Sanders remained silent, simply staring at Balher. Balher seemed to understand. Even on the high ground during the day, they couldn't hold out. The enemy would bombard the high ground several times with naval guns, and then even more so. Sanders then added, "The attack I'm talking about isn't about charging the enemy positions, it's about spreading out and building fortifications in front of the enemy, confronting them, 500 meters, 400 meters, or even closer. As long as you're close enough, the enemy's naval guns won't be effective, understand?" Balher suddenly realized. Naval guns had accuracy problems. At sea, they often missed their targets by several kilometers. Once the Ottoman army built fortifications in front of the enemy, instead of staying far away on the high ground, the enemy's naval guns would hesitate to fire for a fear of friendly fire. "Understood, General," Balher nodded. "Wait," Sanders called out to Balher, who was about to leave. "You're now the commander of the Third Corps." Balher looked surprised. He often opposed Sanders and assumed the two disliked each other. "Don't misunderstand." Sanders understood Balher's expression and explained, "I still don't like you, but this is war, and you are the most suitable candidate to be the commander of the Third Corps." Balher nodded in understanding and then stood up to salute Sanders. Sanders watched Balher's retreating figure and nodded slightly. Undeniably, he was an excellent soldier. He had once led over 500 men to hold off an attack by 8,000 Allied Anzac troops, all was fighting on the front lines. Now, a commander like him, leading from the front, was needed. After returning to the defensive line, Balher immediately adjusted the troop deployment. He dispersed the forces originally concentrated on the high ground, scattering them here and there. On the surface, there was no obvious defensive line, but once the enemy launched an attack, they would emerge from all corners. Sanders must be thinking this way, Balher said. To keep the enemy's naval guns from finding their targets, while keeping their eyes fixed on the enemy's infantry, this tactic tests the quality of the army. With soldiers scattered and unsupervised, those with weak willpower are likely to desert. But Balher wasn't worried about this, because the Ottoman army was defending their homeland, and the soldiers had a determination and courage to fight. After doing all this, Balher drew a detailed map of the troop deployment and reported it to Sanders. Sanders looked at the map and nodded in satisfaction. He hadn't made a mistake in choosing this commander, he fully understood his principles and implemented them. However, could this stop the Allied attack? That was Charles, after all, he always delivered a fatal blow unexpectedly. Just as in response to Sanders, a sudden burst of fierce artillery fire shook the ground, and debris from the rooftops fell with a whooshing sound. Sanders knew something was wrong. He recognized it as a barrage of heavy bombardment from large-caliber naval guns. And the enemy would use naval guns for such a large-scale bombardment for only one purpose, to prepare for a landing. Could this be Charles's landing spot? How could he dare choose this place? Impossible. Yet, the facts were undeniable. Naval guns relentlessly bombarded Boral, flames and smoke filled the air, the land trembled as if being lifted into the air, houses shattered and collapsed like porcelain. And screams were completely drowned out by the cannon fire. The staff officer rushed to Sanders in a panic, shouting, "General, the enemy fleet has entered Saros Bay and is landing just northwest of us." Chapter 299 Boragel. HMS Queen Elizabeth was filled with officers from both the Army and Navy, sitting around a small round table. Besides several French officers, including Charles, Tidjany, and Gayplatz, there were British officers such as General Winter and General Hamilton. General Hamilton was the commander of the British landing forces. During his tenure as Lieutenant General Robeck, he believed that commanders of local operations like Charles didn't need to meet and communicate with a commander-in-chief like Hamilton. It was a waste of time. Therefore, this was Hamilton's first meeting with Charles. The image above shows Ian Hamilton, who served as commander-in-chief of the British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force during the Dardanelles campaign, commanding the Army's landing operations. Hamilton appeared refined and cultured, perhaps due to his good literary background. He was known as the poet general for his poetry. However, at this moment, he looked weary, his eyes filled with worry, and he seemed devoid of any poetic air. General Hamilton seemed quite displeased with Charles's dismissal of Lieutenant General Roebuck. He entered the conference room and, upon sitting down, asked Charles in a provocative tone, "So, you're finally going to carry out the landing, Colonel?" "Yes, you could say that," Charles replied. "When?" General Hamilton asked, his tone tinged with reproach. "This time, there won't be any submarines, will there?" "Of course, General," Charles said nonchalantly. "Tomorrow, still dawn. Attack at daybreak." The reason for always choosing this time was the special nature of dawn. The Allied forces, with their naval superiority, could prepare for the attack under cover of darkness, such as having landing troops climb rope ladders onto landing craft, and even allowing the landing craft to sail near the landing zone without being detected by the enemy. "Very good," Hamilton nodded in satisfaction. "Then, I will order the troops at W Beach and S Beach to meet you. I hope you'll be on time this time." With that, Hamilton rose to leave, as if his mission could end there. If the landing method were the same as before, it would indeed be similar: set a time and place, exchange troop communication codes, and then everything else could wait until the landing was successful. But Charles stopped Hamilton. "General, the problem is I didn't plan to land at V Beach." Hamilton was taken aback, then sat back down in his chair, looking at Charles with a puzzled expression. "Not landing at V Beach? Then you plan to, Heir?" Charles replied. Hamilton laughed. "No, that's impossible. We can't land at Heir. That would be suicide." The image above shows the location of Heir, on the south shore of Saros Bay, at the choke point of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Charles didn't speak. He was waiting for Hamilton's analysis. Sure enough, Hamilton spread his hands to both sides. "Don't you think so? We've already analyzed it. I know Heir is a strategic location. A landing there could cut off the Ottoman supply lines by choking off the Gallipoli Peninsula, but the Ottomans know that too. They've deployed a division of over 10,000 men there, along with coastal artillery. Furthermore, if we land at Heir, the fleet must enter the Gulf of Saros. We could be attacked from three sides." The officers unanimously agreed. It was clear that the Gulf of Saros was a narrow bay, roughly U-shaped, only a dozen kilometers wide. Warships entering this area would be in a very passive position, vulnerable to bombardment from three sides. Even the most heavily armored battleships might not withstand it. General Winter also began to doubt Charles's plan. "I've seen the battle report, Colonel." General Winter frowned slightly. "We launched a feint attack on Heir before, which gave the Ottomans time to prepare. Do you think we should change the location, precisely because we launched a feint attack before?" Charles interrupted General Winter. "This will make the Ottomans think we can't attack here." Hamilton's lips curled into a sneer. "Then, how do you plan to solve the problem of the warships being attacked from three sides?" Charles rose leisurely and pointed to the map, saying, "The key to the plan is timing. Our fleet will enter Saros Bay before dawn to bombard Heir, and then withdraw after dawn. At the same time, the landing force will land at the exact moment of dawn. If the fleet operates at night, there's no need to consider the problem of being attacked from three sides." "Easier said than done," Hamilton interrupted Charles. "Landing at the exact moment of dawn, how can you guarantee such a short window of opportunity? If you fail, you will suffer a fatal blow." Charles turned his gaze to Tigony. Tigony understood and rose to distribute the prepared landing craft diagrams to the officers. When handing one to Hamilton, Tigony explained, "This is a landing craft invented by Charles, General. It can carry 32 fully armed soldiers at a time, and we have 20. That means we can land over 600 people at once, and the landing process only takes a few minutes." Hamilton took the diagram and his expression instantly turned serious. The diagram was clear and concise, showing infantry climbing rope ladders onto the landing craft, then sailing at 9 knots to the landing beach, lowering the landing ramps, and the soldiers rushing ashore to launch the attack. After a moment's hesitation, Hamilton said, "This alone might not be enough. As General Winter said, the enemy has already prepared and built defenses at Heir, and our equipment and supplies cannot be transported ashore in time." Tigony then took out a stack of documents and distributed them, this time for the landing craft. Tigony, a confident smile on his face, said as he distributed the drawings, "You're right, General. So we also have landing craft. We'll use them to get supplies ashore." We've even added frontal armor to them, 11 millimeters thick, enough to stop bullets." Everyone gasped when they received the sketches. It was a strange ship with car wheels. General Winter looked at the sketches and asked incredulously, This is an amphibious ship." "Yes," Tijani nodded. "Transporting supplies for amphibious operations has always been a problem, a huge problem, gentlemen. It has to be hoisted from the transport ship onto a wooden boat, then transported to the shore, and then carried by manpower. But with this kind of ship," Tijani gestured with the sketches in his hand. Everyone understood. With this amphibious landing craft, not only could supplies be transported ashore in one go, but it could also be used as a vehicle after landing. More importantly, with a machine gun and a few soldiers, it could participate in amphibious operations, providing protection and covering fire for the landing forces. Such a thing actually existed? Chapter 300 Let the enemy defeat us. The atmosphere in the meeting room changed immediately when Charles presented the two drawings. Most of the officers, who had initially opposed a landing at Boreal, were now filled with confidence. General Winter, looking excitedly at the documents in his hands, exclaimed, "My God, they're practically designed for this battle." He turned to Charles and asked, "Colonel, you didn't already have this in mind for a landing at Boreal, did you?" Tijani countered with a half-smile, "What do you think, General?" The officers were silent for a moment, then burst into laughter. General Winter realized he had asked a foolish question. Charles had already built them and brought them here, clearly intending to use them in a landing operation while still in France. However, the laughter quickly and strangely subsided. The officer noticed General Hamilton sitting quietly, expressionless, staring at the two drawings before him, saying nothing. "Do you have any different opinions, General Hamilton?" General Winter asked. Hamilton grunted, tossed the blueprints onto the table, looked up at Charles, and said coldly, "I admire your ingenuity, Colonel. I won't even mention the many uncertainties involved, but even if you manage to land successfully," Hamilton paused, his gaze sweeping to both sides, and emphasized, "Note that Charles plans to land between dawn and daybreak. This means Charles doesn't have much time left for the landing. These 20 landing craft and 20 landing ships might need to make 3 or 4 round trips to transport 3,000 men ashore." Hamilton tapped his finger on the table, making a rhythmic clicking sound. "So, how are you going to defeat an Ottoman division of tens of thousands with these 3,000 men, and the Ottomans will have a constant stream of reinforcements, while we, because the landing zone might be blocked by enemy artillery fire at dawn, will find it difficult to increase our forces?" The officers were all stunned. They hadn't considered this possibility. The Ottomans had already constructed complete fortifications and deployed a division at Boreal. Even if Charles's 3,000 men could land, they might not be able to capture Boreal and cut off their supply lines. Charles remained calm, his tone unhurried. "We don't need to defeat this division, nor do we need to defeat their continuous reinforcements." Hamilton looked at Charles, puzzled. How could they cut off Boreal without defeating the enemy? Charles added, "We want the enemy to defeat us." The others were confused, but Hamilton understood. He looked at Charles with shock, a hint of surprise and caution flashing in his eyes. General Winter still didn't understand. He asked curiously, "Let the enemy defeat us? What's the difference between that and defeating the enemy?" "Of course there's a difference, General," Charles replied. "When we defeat the enemy, its army attacking their lines. 3,000 men are certainly far from enough to take down an enemy division, let alone their reinforcements." General Winter said and then added, "Letting the enemy defeat us means we build fortifications and wait for them to attack." Thinking about it, General Winter realized it made sense. In trench warfare, especially since the Ottoman Empire lacked tanks, 3,000 men were more than enough to defend against an attack of over 10,000, provided they were equipped with sufficient machine guns and had a guaranteed ammunition supply. But General Winter frowned again. "But why would the enemy jump out of their trenches to attack our lines? Why can't they just hold their positions?" Most of the other officers had the same question. Being unfamiliar with land warfare, they assumed that a blockade could only be achieved through troop occupation. At this moment, General Hamilton spoke up. "Artillery blockade." The officers were taken aback, then understood Charles's intention. Hamilton looked somewhat dejected, like a defeated rooster, but he still pointed to the map and analyzed. "This choke point at Boreal is only 6 kilometers wide. The road in the middle is less than 3 kilometers from the coast, while our 75mm guns have a range of 8 kilometers. In other words, we can block the road with artillery fire as soon as we land, and then wait for the enemy to attack." In Chinese terms, this is called defense as offense. General Winter and his officers finally understood. The Ottoman army would then have no choice but to attack, because only by attacking and defeating Charles's 3,000 men could the supply lines on the Gallipoli Peninsula be prevented from being blocked by artillery fire. Charles nodded slightly. More or less. What do you mean by more or less? Hamilton asked, a hint of reluctance on his face. Charles replied, you've forgotten something, General. The terrain around Bordel is flat for several kilometers, but there are high ground on both sides. The Ottomans have already deployed German reinforced 105mm howitzers on those high grounds, with a range of 12 kilometers. Hamilton's expression stiffened. That means the enemy's artillery can hit us, but we can't hit the enemy. Yes, Charles replied, so, if we block the road with 75mm guns, we're doomed. No matter how many 75mm guns we bring ashore, they'll undoubtedly be blown to bits. So you mean, Charles pointed to a defensive line in front of Bordel and said, Bordel is too sensitive to the enemy. Once our landing is successful, the enemy will immediately send a large number of troops to try and drive us back into the sea. Therefore, we don't even have time to build fortifications. All we can do is take this defensive line and use it. The officer's eyes focused on the defensive line Charles was pointing to. That was a defensive line built by the Ottomans to prevent an Allied landing. It was shaped like a reverse arc facing the landing angle. Once Charles could capture this line, he could immediately use it as his own position. The red line in the image above indicates the defensive line Charles wanted to seize. Charles continued, the advantages of capturing this line are twofold. First, it will create space for our follow-up troops to land, allowing landing forces and supplies to come ashore every night to strengthen the blockade of Bordel. Second, it's only 600 meters from the road salient, while our mortars have a range of 700 meters. The officers in the conference room suddenly understood. Charles intended to use mortars to block the road. General Winter smiled and nodded. It was a good idea. In areas where artillery fire was weaker, mortars were clearly more survivable than 75mm guns, and they were also easier to transport. Hamilton, however, looked thoughtful. He paused for a while before letting out a soft sigh, his once confident face now showing signs of weariness. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.